My name is Tobias Lockwood. I'm a disease ecologist who survived the first 48 hours of the nuclear alien apocalypse. When Detroit was hit by the blast, I thought nuclear war was the worst that could happen. I was wrong. The aliens arrived 3 days later, hunting survivors and terraforming our planet. This is how I used my scientific knowledge to stay alive when humanity faced extinction on two fronts. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Tobias Lockwood. I'm a disease ecologist who survived the first 48 hours of the nuclear alien apocalypse. When Detroit was hit by the blast, I thought nuclear war was the worst that could happen. I was wrong. The aliens arrived 3 days later, hunting survivors and terraforming our planet. This is how I used my scientific knowledge to stay alive when humanity faced extinction on two fronts. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to establish some credibility here so you understand why my testimony matters. Before everything went to hell, I worked for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a field researcher specializing in zoonotic diseases. That means I study how diseases jump from animals to humans. Things like bird flu, Ebola, and, well, you know what caused the pandemic a few years back. My specific focus was on emerging infectious diseases in wildlife populations and tracking unusual pathogen mutations. I spent most of my time in remote locations collecting samples, monitoring wildlife behavior patterns, and analyzing data to identify potential threats before they became the next global health crisis. My team was stationed at a field research facility near the Michigan-Canadian border, monitoring unusual wildlife behaviors in the northern forests. We had equipment to test radiation levels, microscopes for field analysis, bacterial culturing kits, tools that would later save my life and others. I'm recording this because information is survival currency now. If you're watching this, you've managed to find working equipment and power. Congratulations! You're already doing better than most. I hope what I share helps you stay alive longer. This isn't just my story. It's a survival guide based on scientific observation of both the nuclear aftermath and our unwelcome visitors. My background gave me advantages most people didn't have when everything collapsed. I understood radiation exposure risks, contamination protocols, and, most importantly, how to observe patterns in what initially seemed like chaos. Scientists are trained to notice things others might miss. It's how we identify new diseases before they spread. Those same skills apply to recognizing alien behavior patterns and environmental changes. The first sign something was wrong came weeks before the bombs. Wildlife in our research areas began exhibiting unusual migration patterns, moving south in large numbers despite it being the wrong season. Our monitoring stations picked up atmospheric anomalies too, sudden temperature fluctuations, strange electromagnetic readings that our equipment classified as errors. But machines don't make that many errors in sequence. Dr. Elena Petrov, our atmospheric specialist, insisted something was interfering with Earth's upper atmosphere. The higher-ups dismissed her concerns, attributing them to equipment calibration issues. They ordered new equipment, which showed the same readings. Elena kept pushing, but was eventually told to stick to her lane and focus on normal research parameters. Then there was Kevin Matsuda, our satellite data analyst. 3 weeks before everything happened, he pulled me aside after hours. "Toby, I need your eyes on something," he said, showing me his tablet. The data showed what appeared to be objects holding position just beyond Earth's orbit, objects that would occasionally move with purpose and precision. "These aren't satellites or space junk," Kevin insisted. "Their movement patterns indicate intelligent control." I should have paid more attention to Kevin. We all should have. The CDC receives unusual data all the time. Most of it turns out to be nothing. I told him to document everything and submit it through proper channels. He did. His reports vanished into the bureaucratic void. My team consisted of 6 other researchers, each specializing in different areas. Dr. Abigail West was our microbiologist doctor. Marcus Chen focused on mammalian behavior. Dr. Layla Noor specialized in avian diseases, and Dr. James Wilson was our entomologist. There was also Dr. Carlos Rodriguez, who studied aquatic ecosystems. We were a close-knit group, spending months together in isolated research conditions. None of them were conspiracy theorists or alarmists, just methodical scientists following evidence. Dr. Rodriguez was the first to notice fish were dying in nearby lakes without any apparent pathogen or pollution source. The water tested clean, but the fish died anyway. Dr. Noor reported birds abandoning nesting sites mid-season, something that simply doesn't happen naturally. Dr. Chen tracked unusual predator behavior, wolves and bears seemingly fleeing their territories without competition or food shortage driving them. All these warnings were filed in our reports. All of them were noted, categorized, and effectively ignored by headquarters. In retrospect, I believe some people in government knew what was coming. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to start moving key personnel and equipment away from major population centers. A week before the first bomb, our facility received an unusual visitor, a military attaché who claimed to be conducting a standard security review. Colonel Hargreaves spent 3 days reviewing our research data, particularly focused on our atmospheric readings and satellite analyses. He asked pointed questions about our radiation detection capabilities and took copies of Kevin's orbital anomaly reports. When I asked why a military officer was interested in wildlife disease research, he simply said, "National security concerns overlap all scientific domains these days, Dr. Lockwood." The colonel left with copies of all our data. 2 days later, our facility director announced we'd be operating with reduced staff for the next month due to budget considerations. Half our team was reassigned to other locations. Kevin was among them, sent to a facility in Montana with little explanation. Elena was transferred to CDC headquarters in Atlanta. I was scheduled to leave the following week. The day before Detroit was hit, I received a personal call from Dr. Victor Hammond, my former professor and mentor. He'd never called me directly at work before, always went through proper channels. "Toby," he said, "I think you should take some personal time. Go somewhere remote, somewhere you feel safe." When I asked why, there was a long pause. "Let's just say some of my colleagues in certain government departments are taking sudden vacations. Pack your emergency kit. Take your research notes. Go analog for a while." He hung up before I could ask more questions. I didn't immediately heed his warning. Scientists are skeptical by nature. We want evidence, not vague warnings. But that evening, I noticed something that finally triggered my own internal alarm. While organizing research samples, I saw military transport planes flying north, dozens of them all heading toward the Canadian border. Not just 1 or 2, which might be normal, but a constant stream for over 3 hours. Something was happening. I decided to visit my grandfather's old hunting cabin for the weekend, a place deep in the Michigan wilderness, off-grid, with its own well and solar panels he'd installed years ago. I packed my field kit, radiation detector, portable microscope, first aid supplies, water purification tablets, high-calorie ration bars, and my research tablet with solar charger. I also brought my grandfather's old ham radio set, mostly out of nostalgia since he'd taught me how to use it as a kid. That night, during our team dinner, conversation was unusually subdued. Dr. Wilson, who rarely spoke about anything but insects, suddenly asked if anyone had noticed the military convoys heading out of cities. Dr. West mentioned her sister in the Army had unexpectedly been granted leave and told to go somewhere quiet for a while. We all shared similar observations, but none of us connected the dots completely. We were researchers, trained to be cautious about conclusions without sufficient data. As I was leaving the facility, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized. Major David Chen, a military liaison I'd worked with during a potential outbreak investigation 2 years prior. "Lockwood, where are you right now?" he asked without preamble. "Just leaving the research station," I replied. "Why?" "Get out of the city. Now head for your cabin. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Don't stop for anyone. I can't say more." "What's happening, David?" "Something I hoped would never happen. Go. Now." The line went dead. I drove through the night, watching military vehicles moving in the opposite direction. Local police were directing traffic away from major highways. News channels reported military exercises and advised citizens to remain calm. Some mentioned international tensions but provided no specific information about imminent threats. As I drove, I noticed something else, something I initially attributed to exhaustion or tricks of light. The stars seemed wrong. Not just the usual light pollution affecting visibility, but what looked like stars moving in formation. I pulled over at one point, using my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw made my blood run cold. Objects descending and ascending in Earth's upper atmosphere, too large and moving too deliberately to be meteors or satellites. I arrived at the cabin around 3 in the morning. The forest was eerily quiet. No nocturnal wildlife sounds, no insects chirping. Anyone who spends time in nature knows silence in the woods is a warning sign. Predators or severe weather can cause temporary quiet, but this silence felt absolute. The animals knew something we didn't. I unpacked quickly, setting up my equipment in the cabin's main room. The radiation detector showed normal background levels. The shortwave radio picked up nothing but static across most bands. On a few emergency frequencies, I caught fragments of urgent messages. Military communications implementing something called Protocol Lighthouse. I tried calling my colleagues but couldn't get a signal. Internet access was spotty but functional. News sites were running stories about military movements near major cities, with government officials providing vague reassurances about precautionary measures. Social media was flooded with speculation and reports of unusual aircraft sightings. I managed a few hours of restless sleep before being awakened by a notification from my tablet. The automated alert system I'd programmed to monitor CDC emergency channels had triggered. The message was simple but terrifying. Crimson Protocol activated. All personnel implement shelter procedures immediately. Crimson Protocol was something we'd trained for but never expected to use. It meant imminent national catastrophe, specifically CBRN events, chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear. I'd barely processed this when my radiation detector started beeping. I had to set the radiation detector aside as I tried to process what was happening. The Crimson Protocol wasn't something implemented for drills or minor incidents. It meant something catastrophic was imminent or already underway. Let me backtrack a bit and tell you about the day before everything happened. The last normal day, though it didn't feel normal even then. I'd arrived at the research station early that morning around 6. The sunrise was strange, too red with unusual cloud formations that Dr. Petrov would have analyzed for hours if she had still been there. The facility seemed quieter than usual, with half our team already reassigned. I was reviewing data from our wildlife tracking systems when the facility director, Dr. Sandra Hayes, called an emergency meeting. When I entered the conference room, I immediately noticed the unfamiliar faces. 3 men and a woman in civilian clothes but with unmistakable military posture. They didn't introduce themselves. "Team," Dr. Hayes began, her voice strained. These individuals are from a joint task force and need immediate access to all our research data, particularly the atmospheric anomalies, wildlife migration patterns, and satellite observations from the past 6 months. One of the men stepped forward. We need everything transferred to secure drives. No copies are to be retained on your systems. This is a matter of national security. His tone left no room for questions, but scientists are naturally curious and skeptical. Dr. Wilson spoke up first. May I ask what specific aspect of our research has national security implications? The woman responded, her voice flat. The specific nature of our interest is classified. You've all signed confidentiality agreements with the federal government. This falls under those agreements. They spent 6 hours extracting our data. I watched as they paid particular attention to Kevin's orbital anomaly findings and Dr. Rodriguez's water sample analyses. They took biological samples from our storage facilities, including tissue from animals that had exhibited unusual behaviors. They were thorough and methodical, but their urgency was palpable. As they prepared to leave, I approached the woman, who seemed slightly more approachable than her colleagues. This isn't just about data security, is it? I asked quietly. She looked at me for a long moment. Doctor Lockwood, right? The zoonotic disease specialist? I nodded. Let's just say your skill set might be valuable in the coming weeks. Stay alert. She handed me her card with only a name, Major Rebecca Collins, and a number. After they left, Dr. Hayes called me into her office. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. Toby, I think you should take some personal time, she said, echoing my mentor's words from the previous day. Sandra, what's going on? First Hammond tells me to disappear, then these people show up, and now you're telling me to take time off. She rubbed her temples. I can't say much. I've been briefed on certain possibilities, and I'm making recommendations accordingly. You have that cabin, right? Go there. Be prepared for anything. Take your equipment. That's all I can say. The facility was eerily quiet for the rest of the day. The remaining team members worked silently, occasionally exchanging concerned glances. During lunch, Dr. West showed me a text from her sister. Stay away from major cities next few days. Not a drill. Dr. Wilson mentioned that his amateur astronomy friends had been tracking unusual objects in orbit, objects that didn't match any known satellite patterns. By mid-afternoon, I noticed increased military air traffic, not just transport planes now, but fighter jets patrolling in regular patterns. Local news mentioned enhanced security measures but provided no details. International news was more concerning, with reports of diplomatic missions being evacuated in several major capitals. I decided to follow the mounting advice and head to my grandfather's cabin. Before leaving, I had one last dinner with my remaining colleagues at the small diner we frequented in the nearby town. The mood was somber. Anyone else feel like we're being kept in the dark about something massive? Dr. Wilson asked, pushing his food around his plate. Dr. West nodded. My sister hasn't responded to any messages since this morning. That's not like her. I keep thinking about Kevin's orbital anomaly data, I said. Those objects he tracked, they weren't natural. You think we're looking at some kind of first contact scenario? Dr. Rodriguez asked skeptically. I don't know what to think anymore, I replied. But I know enough about government protocols to recognize when high-level containment procedures are being implemented. This isn't just military posturing. As we were leaving the diner, I noticed something odd. The town seemed half empty. The usual evening traffic was absent. Many businesses had closed signs displayed despite their normal operating hours. People were loading vehicles with supplies, resembling evacuation behavior, though no evacuation had been ordered. I stopped at a gas station to fill up before the long drive to the cabin. The attendant was an older man I'd seen many times before. "Heading out of town, Doc?" he asked as I paid. "Just going up to my cabin for a few days," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Smart move. My son's in the National Guard. Called this morning. Told us to stock up and stay put. Wouldn't say why." He leaned closer. "Been seeing strange lights at night, too. North of town, where there shouldn't be any." I returned to the research facility to collect my personal items and field equipment. The night security guard, a retired military man named Frank, was unusually talkative. "Lot of activity on the emergency bands tonight, Doc," he said as I signed out. "Military's moving some serious hardware. Haven't seen this level of mobilization since I was active duty." "Any idea what's happening?" I asked. "Nothing official, but I recognize the patterns. Last time I saw this was during Cuba." He didn't need to elaborate. He was referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis. "Got your go bag ready?" "Heading to my cabin now," I confirmed. He nodded approvingly. "Good man. Keep your head down. Things might get rough." As I packed my truck, I made a decision to take more than just my personal research equipment. I accessed the facility's emergency supplies, taking a more advanced radiation detector, water purification system, emergency medical kit, and a satellite phone. These weren't strictly mine to take, but something told me the normal rules were about to become irrelevant. I called my sister in California before leaving. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message telling her to grab essentials and head to our parents' mountain house outside San Diego. I tried my parents next. No answer there either. My stomach tightened with worry. The roads were unusually busy for that time of night. All lanes heading out of urban areas were congested, while inbound lanes were nearly empty. Police presence was heavy, and I passed several military checkpoints that had been established on major highways. They weren't stopping vehicles leaving the city, only those trying to enter. During the drive, I turned on the radio. Most stations were playing normal programming, but emergency alerts interrupted frequently, advising citizens to remain calm and follow instructions from authorities. One news station reported that military bases across the country had been elevated to their highest alert status. Another mentioned satellite communications disruptions affecting certain regions. I switched to the shortwave radio I kept in my truck, scanning for emergency broadcasts. Most frequencies were active with coded military communications. I recognized some of the coding patterns from my work with government response teams during disease outbreaks. They were implementing contingency plans for something major. As I mentioned earlier, the night sky looked wrong during that drive. Using my background in observational science, I could tell the moving lights weren't conventional aircraft. They moved too fast, changed direction too abruptly, and occasionally seemed to blink out of existence before reappearing elsewhere. Had I not been specifically looking for them, I might have dismissed them as tricks of tired eyes. I arrived at the cabin around 3 in the morning, as I mentioned before. The forest's unnatural silence was deeply unsettling for someone who understands wildlife behavior. I quickly unloaded my equipment and supplies, setting up a monitoring station in the main room. The cabin was basic, but well-equipped. Solar panels for electricity, a well for water, propane for cooking and heating, and enough preserved food to last a month if necessary. My grandfather had been a Cold War veteran with a healthy dose of paranoia. He'd built the cabin with survival in mind: reinforced walls, a cellar that doubled as a fallout shelter, and multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest. I'd always found his preparations excessive, but that night I was grateful for his foresight. The cabin had no internet connection, but the satellite phone could access basic text data. Headlines were becoming increasingly alarming. United Nations calls emergency session, military deployments accelerate worldwide, President to address nation at dawn. Something major was unfolding, but specific details were scarce. I tried to rest, but couldn't sleep. Instead, I prepared. I inventoried supplies, checked equipment, and established a perimeter monitoring system using motion sensors from my wildlife research kit. I loaded my grandfather's hunting rifles, not something I ever thought I'd need, but instinct told me to be prepared for anything. Around 5 in the morning, I picked up a clear broadcast on the emergency frequencies. A military commander was instructing all units to implement Operation Dark Shield immediately. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Moments later, my tablet alerted me to the CDC's Crimson Protocol activation, and my radiation detector began registering elevated levels. I stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The sky to the southeast, the direction of Detroit, was beginning to glow with an unnatural light. I knew what was coming. I ran back inside, grabbed my emergency kit, and headed for the cellar. As I secured the hatch, the world outside went blindingly white. The blast was far enough away that the cabin wasn't immediately destroyed, but the shockwave hit about 40 seconds later. The structure groaned and creaked, dust falling from the ceiling of the cellar. The radiation detector's readings spiked dramatically before stabilizing at elevated but not immediately lethal levels. I remained in the cellar for 3 hours, monitoring radiation readings and listening to the emergency broadcasts that were still functioning. Nuclear detonations had occurred near multiple major cities across the country. The broadcasts provided no information about who had attacked or why. Some suggested it was a limited exchange rather than full-scale nuclear war, which aligned with the patterns I was observing in the data. When I finally emerged from the cellar, the cabin was damaged but standing. Windows were shattered and debris had been thrown around, but the structure was intact. Outside, the forest had suffered, trees knocked down in the direction facing the blast, smaller vegetation flattened. But it wasn't the wasteland I'd feared. The radiation levels were concerning, but not immediately lethal. My training in handling hazardous biological materials was now proving valuable in an unexpected way. I knew how to minimize exposure, how to decontaminate, how to assess safe exposure times. I secured the cabin as best I could, using plastic sheeting to cover broken windows and establishing a decontamination area at the entrance. The satellite phone was still functioning, though connections were intermittent. Emergency broadcasts advised all survivors to shelter in place and await further instructions. There was no information about who had launched the attacks or whether more were expected. The uncertainty was almost worse than the attack itself. I tried reaching my family and colleagues again. No success. Communications infrastructure was heavily damaged or overwhelmed. I recorded all available data: radiation levels, atmospheric conditions, time of impact, maintaining the scientific mindset that had been drilled into me through years of training. Observation and documentation might seem trivial during a nuclear attack, but information would be crucial for survivors. As night fell on that first day, I observed something that made little sense given what had just occurred. The strange moving lights in the sky had increased in number and activity. If these were military aircraft responding to the attack, their flight patterns were unlike anything I'd ever seen documented. They moved with precision impossible for human pilots, especially under post-nuclear conditions with electromagnetic interference and radiation hazards. I documented everything I observed, drawing on my training as a scientist. The rational part of my mind insisted these had to be advanced military drones or aircraft. But another part, the part that had listened to Kevin's concerns about objects in orbit, wondered if we were experiencing something beyond conventional warfare. I didn't know then that within hours those lights would descend from the sky, bringing a second apocalypse to an already devastated world. The nuclear exchange, as horrible as it was only the beginning. What followed would require every bit of scientific knowledge and survival instinct I possessed. The radiation detector continued beeping as I processed what was happening. I needed to see for myself. Despite knowing better, I moved to the cabin's east-facing window, the one that looked toward Detroit. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The horizon glowed with an unnatural brightness, and above it rose the unmistakable mushroom cloud. Detroit was gone. I've replayed that moment countless times in my mind since then. The sheer enormity of it was impossible to process fully. One moment, a city of millions existed. The next, it was vaporized. My scientific mind immediately began calculating blast radius, fallout patterns, radiation dispersion based on current wind conditions. It was easier to think about the physics than the human toll. Let me take you through what happened next in detail. I need you to understand how quickly everything changed and why my background helped me survive when so many others didn't. I immediately began implementing radiation protocols. First, I sealed every opening in the cabin using plastic sheeting and duct tape from my emergency supplies. I established a decontamination area by the entrance, a place to remove and store potentially contaminated clothing and equipment. I filled all available containers with water before any potential fallout could contaminate the well. The EMP from the blast had disabled most electronic equipment, but my grandfather's old Geiger counter was analog and still functioning. My scientific equipment had been in the cellar, shielded from the electromagnetic pulse. The satellite phone was damaged but occasionally connected for brief periods. About 40 minutes after the initial blast, I picked up fragmented emergency broadcasts. Multiple detonations had occurred across the country. Not a full-scale nuclear exchange, but strategic strikes against major population and military centers. No information about the attackers was provided. Government continuity protocols had been activated, with surviving leadership relocated to hardened facilities. I stayed in the cabin that first day, monitoring radiation levels and documenting everything. My training as a scientist, the methodical approach to observation and data collection, gave me purpose amid the chaos. I recorded radiation readings hourly, noted weather patterns that might affect fallout dispersion, and kept a log of all functional communications I could intercept. By morning of the second day, I had to make a difficult decision. My supplies were limited, and I needed to know more about the surrounding area, radiation levels beyond my immediate vicinity, possible survivors, functioning infrastructure. I suited up in protective gear from my field kit, designed for collecting samples in biohazard zones. It wasn't ideal for radiation protection, but it was better than nothing. I emerged from the cabin into an altered landscape. The familiar forest looked wounded, trees splintered or knocked flat in the direction facing the blast, ash covering everything. The air smelled wrong, a metallic scent that caught in the back of my throat despite my respirator mask. Radiation readings were elevated but not immediately lethal for short exposure. I moved carefully, keeping exposure time minimal. About 2 miles from the cabin, I encountered the first survivors, a family of 4 traveling on foot, disoriented and showing early signs of radiation sickness. They had been camping when the blast occurred and had no idea what happened beyond seeing the explosion. "We thought it was some kind of accident," the father told me, his voice hoarse. "A chemical plant or something. We tried calling emergency services, but nothing worked." I explained what little I knew about the nuclear strikes while checking them for immediate medical needs. The children, a boy about 10 and a girl around 8, showed no obvious symptoms yet, but the parents had radiation burns on exposed skin. I gave them some of my radiation tablets and directed them toward my cabin, providing them with a crude map. As I continued my survey, I encountered more survivors, mostly people who had been in rural areas when the attacks occurred. Some were injured from the blast wave, others showing signs of radiation exposure. All were desperate for information I largely couldn't provide. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered crucial data about radiation distribution and identified several buildings that remained relatively intact. I returned to the cabin to find the family I'd encountered earlier waiting outside. I guided them through decontamination procedures before allowing them inside. The father introduced himself as Michael Reeves, a high school science teacher. His wife Sarah was a nurse, a fortunate coincidence given our situation. Their children, David and Emma, were frightened but coping remarkably well considering the circumstances. Sarah immediately began assessing and treating the radiation burns on her husband's arms with supplies from my medical kit. "Have you heard anything about who did this?" Michael asked as Sarah worked. I shook my head. Emergency broadcasts mention multiple strikes but provide no information about the attackers. "It doesn't make sense," Sarah said, not looking up from her work. "This isn't a full-scale nuclear war. These seem like targeted strikes." She was right. The pattern didn't match a Cold War scenarios of mutually assured destruction. These were precise attacks against specific targets with seemingly minimal use of nuclear weapons relative to the arsenals we knew existed. It suggested either remarkable restraint or some other factor limiting the exchange. That evening, more survivors arrived, having seen the solar panels on the cabin roof. By nightfall, 11 people had gathered. The Reeves family, an elderly couple named Frank and Martha Wilson, 3 college students who had been hiking, and a truck driver named Ray, who had been outside the blast radius when his truck died from the EMP. I shared what supplies I could and organized the group, establishing radiation safety protocols and rationing water and food. My research facility training in emergency management proved unexpectedly valuable. We converted the main room of the cabin into a communal space and set up shifts for monitoring radiation levels and keeping watch. The college students, Amy, Jason, and Miguel, had been environmental science majors on a field study. They helped me establish a more comprehensive monitoring system using their surviving equipment combined with mine. Frank, who had military experience from decades ago, helped organize the defensive perimeter around the cabin. Ray had been delivering medical supplies when the attack happened. His truck contained antibiotics, painkillers, and other medications that might prove invaluable. We carefully retrieved these from his disabled vehicle about a mile away, minimizing our radiation exposure. That night, as others slept, I maintained watch with Frank. The old veteran seemed unnaturally calm about our situation. "You've seen something like this before?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "No one's seen anything like this before, son. But I was stationed at a nuclear missile silo in the 80s. We ran scenarios similar to this: limited nuclear exchange, strategic strikes. Any scenarios about what happens next?" Frank looked out the window at the night sky, where those strange lights continued their impossible movements. "Nothing that accounts for those." The next morning, we caught a fragmented emergency broadcast advising survivors to move away from blast zones and major cities. The message mentioned extraction points being established but cut off before providing locations. Radiation levels had stabilized but remained dangerous for extended exposure. We decided to send out scouting parties to gather more information and supplies. I went with Miguel, heading east toward a small town about 5 miles away. We wore improvised protective gear and carried radiation detectors. The landscape became increasingly surreal as we moved closer to the blast radius. Twisted metal, ash-covered ground, and occasionally human remains that we tried not to look at too closely. The town was partially standing but clearly abandoned. Buildings near the eastern edge had been damaged by the blast wave. We carefully searched a pharmacy and grocery store, finding some unspoiled supplies. As we worked, Miguel suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing skyward. One of the strange lights was directly overhead, much lower than I had seen before. It moved with deliberate precision, seeming to scan the area below. We ducked into a building, watching through a broken window. The object, clearly not any conventional aircraft, hovered for several minutes before accelerating away at impossible speed. "What was that?" Miguel asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But we need to get back and warn the others." We returned to the cabin by mid-afternoon, bringing our salvage supplies and the disturbing news about the unidentified craft. The others had similar reports. Strange objects seemingly surveying the devastated landscape. Ray had seen one descend near a group of survivors about 3 miles north, though he couldn't see what happened afterward. That evening, the third since the nuclear strike, we picked up a more sustained emergency broadcast. A military commander identified as General Hayes was advising all survivors to remain sheltered and avoid contact with unidentified aerial phenomena. The broadcast confirmed what we had begun to suspect. These were not conventional aircraft or known military technology. In the event of direct contact with these objects or any entities associated with them, survivors are advised to avoid engagement and conceal their positions, the general stated. Preliminary reports indicate hostile intent. Military response is underway. The broadcast provided no further details before dissolving into static. Our group debated what this meant, theories ranging from experimental foreign technology to the previously unthinkable, non-human intelligence. Whatever they are, they seem drawn to the nuclear explosions, I noted, thinking of the scientific implications. Either they're here because of the attacks, or the attacks happened because they're here. Sleep was difficult that night. The lights in the sky had increased in number and activity. Occasionally, bright flashes suggested conflict, perhaps our military engaging these unknown objects. I continued documenting everything, maintaining the scientific approach that helped me process these events. Before dawn on the fourth day, I was awakened by Martha, who had been on watch. "Something's happening," she said urgently. I joined her at the window. The sky to the north was illuminated by multiple objects descending through the atmosphere. Unlike the smaller craft we had observed, these were massive, easily the size of skyscrapers. They moved with deliberate precision, taking positions above what would have been major cities. As the sun rose, we could see one of these enormous craft in the distance, hovering where Detroit had been. Smaller objects moved between the ground and the larger vessel. Whatever these beings were, they weren't just observing anymore. They were landing. I made a decision then that would determine our survival over the coming days. "We need to move," I told the group. "These entities seem focused on population centers and blast zones. Our best chance is to head deeper into the wilderness, away from their apparent areas of interest." No one argued. We packed essential supplies, established radiation safety measures for the journey, and prepared to abandon the cabin that had sheltered us. Before leaving, I buried some of my research equipment and notes in a waterproof container, information that might prove valuable later if anyone survived to study what was happening. We departed at mid-morning, moving north-northwest, away from both Detroit and the nearest town. Our group moved carefully through the forest, staying under the canopy of surviving trees for concealment. Frank led the way, his military training proving valuable for navigation and security. I maintained rear guard, constantly scanning for any sign of radiation spikes or unusual activity. We'd covered about 8 miles when we heard it, a sound like tearing metal combined with a low-frequency vibration you could feel in your chest more than hear. We froze, instinctively seeking cover among the trees. Through a break in the canopy, we saw one of the smaller craft passing overhead, much closer than any we had observed before. The craft stopped and hovered, as if sensing our presence. We remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, it moved on, continuing its apparent search pattern. "They can detect something," I whispered once I was certain it was gone. "Movement, heat, maybe radiation signatures." "What does that mean for us?" Sarah asked, holding her children close. "It means we need to be smarter about how we move," I replied, "and we need to understand what they're looking for so we can avoid detection." As we continued our journey, I recalled something crucial from my scientific training. Understanding an organism's behavior requires understanding its motivations and sensory capabilities. If we could determine what these entities could detect and what they wanted, we might develop strategies to avoid them. By evening, we had reached a small valley with a stream running through it. The radiation levels were lower here, either because of the distance from the blast or some feature of the terrain that minimized fallout. We established a temporary camp, using natural features for concealment rather than creating obvious structures. That night, we observed increased activity in the sky, more craft moving with purpose, flashes of light suggesting conflict, and the massive vessel now clearly visible over Detroit. Whatever was happening, it was accelerating. The nuclear apocalypse had created an opening for something else, something that may have been watching us for longer than we realized. As I maintained watch that night, the scientific part of my mind continued analyzing everything I had observed. These entities had appeared immediately after the nuclear exchange. They were focused on blast zones and population centers. They could detect certain signatures that revealed human presence. And most importantly, they had not immediately destroyed everything. They were methodical, suggesting specific objectives rather than simple destruction. I didn't know then that within hours we would have our first direct encounter with one of the hunters. What I observed during that encounter would provide crucial insights that would keep us alive in the coming days. Insights that might help you survive if you're watching this and still dealing with these invaders. That first night at our temporary camp was tense and sleepless. We took shifts keeping watch, though none of us really slept much anyway. The sky continued to pulse with strange lights, and occasionally we'd feel that subsonic vibration ripple through the ground. It was quieter in the valley, with the stream masking some of our sounds, but we still spoke in whispers and kept movement to a minimum. Ray volunteered for the pre-dawn watch. He woke me about an hour before sunrise, his expression grim. "You need to see this," he said softly. I followed him to the edge of our camp. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could see strange green mist settling in patches throughout the valley, concentrated near the stream and spreading outward. It didn't behave like natural fog. It seemed almost deliberate in its movement, flowing against the breeze in some places. "What is it?" Ray asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but we should collect a sample." Using equipment from my field kit, I carefully collected a small amount of the greenish substance in a sealed container. The radiation detector showed normal levels, but something about the material made the hair on my arms stand up. It had an unnatural shimmer, and where it touched vegetation, the plant seemed to wilt slightly. By the time the sun rose, the mist had dissipated, but it left behind subtle changes in the affected areas, a slight discoloration of soil and vegetation. I suspected it was some kind of atmospheric alteration, perhaps related to the green vapor we'd seen trailing from the alien craft. We broke camp quickly, eager to move further from areas of alien activity. The children were exhausted and frightened, but they remained remarkably quiet. Emma, the younger of the Reeves children, tugged on my sleeve as we prepared to leave. "The air tastes different," she whispered. "Children often notice things adults miss, their observations unclouded by preconceptions." I took her comment seriously. "Different how, Emma?" She thought for a moment. "Like when Mom cleans the bathroom. Chemical." I nodded, filing away this observation. The alien presence was already affecting our environment in ways we were only beginning to detect. We traveled for several hours, following the valley northward where the terrain provided both cover and a natural path. Around midday, we encountered our first sign of other survivors, a hastily abandoned campsite with supplies still present. A single backpack contained food, water, and a journal with entries dating to just the previous day. The final entry read, "They're hunting people. Not random. They take some, ignore others. Don't know the pattern yet." Frank examined the area with his military-trained eye. No signs of struggle. They left in a hurry, though. I checked the radiation levels in the area, higher than our previous location, but not dangerously so. Something had spooked these survivors enough to abandon valuable supplies. We took what was useful and continued moving, now with heightened caution. The terrain gradually became more rugged, with rock formations offering better concealment. By late afternoon, we found what seemed like a defensible position, a natural cave formation in a hillside, partially hidden by vegetation and with good visibility of the surrounding area. As the others set up our temporary shelter, I examined the sample of green mist I'd collected that morning. Using my portable microscope, I observed structures unlike anything I'd seen before, formations that seemed to shift between solid and gaseous states, with complex molecular arrangements that defied conventional classification. Sarah noticed my concern. "What is it?" "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted. "But it's not natural, at least not to Earth. It seems to be interacting with organic matter at a cellular level." "Is it dangerous?" They described entities emerging from the craft, tall, insect-like beings with multiple limbs moving with precise, almost mechanical motions. "They found a group of survivors," Amy said, her voice shaking. 3 people hiding in an abandoned building. The aliens seemed to scan them with some kind of device, then took 2 of them into their craft. "What about the 3rd person?" I asked. "They just left him," Miguel replied. "He ran as soon as they were gone. We tried to make contact, but he was too frightened." This confirmed my radiation theory. "Did you notice anything about the people they took versus the one they left?" Amy nodded. The 2 they took had visible radiation burns. The one they left appeared uninjured. This information was crucial. The aliens were selectively taking people with higher radiation exposure and ignoring those with minimal exposure. But why? Were they collecting specimens? Conducting some kind of study? Or was it something more sinister? "There's something else," Miguel added. "We saw more of that green mist being released from their craft. It settled on the surrounding vegetation. Within minutes, the plants began to change. The color shifted slightly, and the structure seemed different. This aligned with my analysis of the mist sample." "They're altering our environment," I said. "Terraforming, but on a micro scale, initially." "Why would they do that?" Martha asked. "To make Earth more habitable for them," I explained. "Or less habitable for us." This realization added urgency to our situation. We weren't just dealing with hostile invaders. We were facing entities actively working to transform our planet into something alien. We spent the rest of the day fortifying our position and planning our next move. The cave provided good temporary shelter, but we couldn't stay indefinitely. Resources were limited, and the alien presence seemed to be expanding methodically outward from the blast zones. That evening, as darkness fell, we observed increased aerial activity. The massive craft over Detroit was now clearly visible even at our distance, its enormous form illuminated by strange lights. A smaller craft moved between it and the ground in a constant stream. Frank, who had been watching through binoculars, suddenly tensed. "They're moving this way," he said quietly. "A search pattern, spreading outward from the city." I checked radiation levels around our position, still elevated, but not dramatically so. Would it be enough to attract attention? We should move, Frank advised. Tonight, under cover of darkness. Head further north, away from their expansion pattern. No one argued. We quickly gathered essential supplies and prepared to move out. Just before departing, I buried another cache of notes and samples, marking the location in case we needed to return or to help future survivors understand what was happening. We moved silently through the forest, staying under the canopy whenever possible. The night sky was alive with alien craft, their search patterns becoming more extensive with each passing hour. We used natural features for concealment, ravines, dense vegetation, rock formations, and paused frequently to ensure we weren't being tracked. The children were exhausted, but understood the need for silence. David carried his sister when she became too tired to walk. Sarah and Michael moved with the focused determination of parents protecting their young. Ray and the college students maintained a perimeter around the group, while Frank led us through the terrain using his military navigation skills. Around midnight, we reached a small seasonal waterfall feeding into a series of rocky pools. The falling water masked our sounds, and the surrounding terrain offered multiple escape routes if needed. We decided to rest briefly before continuing our journey. As the others took a moment to recover, I climbed to a vantage point to scan the area we had just traversed. What I saw confirmed my fears. Alien craft were systematically searching the valley we had left, their distinctive lights illuminating sections of forest in a grid pattern. They were being thorough, expanding their search area with methodical precision. I rejoined the group, sharing what I had observed. They're searching everything now, not just targeting radiation hotspots. We need to keep moving. But where? Sarah asked, the exhaustion evident in her voice. How far do we need to go to be safe? It was a question I couldn't answer honestly. Nowhere might be truly safe if these entities continued to expand their presence. But we had to maintain hope. Northern Michigan has vast wilderness areas, I said. Low population density, minimal strategic targets. It's our best chance for now. And we might find other survivors, maybe even organized resistance. Frank nodded in agreement. Military contingency plans would establish outposts in remote areas. If any military units survived, they'll be regrouping away from blast zones. We continued our journey through the night, pushing ourselves to put as much distance as possible between us and the expanding alien search pattern. By dawn, we had covered nearly 15 miles of difficult terrain. We found shelter in a dense stand of pine trees, the thick canopy providing concealment from above. As the sun rose, we could see the transformed landscape behind us. Areas where the green mist had settled now showed visible changes. Vegetation with slightly altered colors and structures, soil with an unnatural sheen. The aliens weren't just hunting survivors. They were beginning to remake our world. The realization hit me then with full force. This wasn't just an invasion following a nuclear exchange. It was colonization. Earth had been weakened by our own weapons, and something had been waiting for that moment of vulnerability. Something that had perhaps been watching us for longer than we knew. I didn't share these darkest thoughts with the group. They needed hope to continue. But as a scientist, I had to face the data objectively. We were witnessing the beginning stages of an extinction event, not just for humans, but for Earth's entire biosphere as we knew it. Yet, even in that moment of grim realization, my scientific mind continued analyzing, looking for patterns and weaknesses. These entities had specific search methodologies. They had biological forms that must have limitations. They were transforming our environment, which meant they couldn't immediately adapt to it as it was. Every organism, no matter how advanced, has vulnerabilities. If these aliens needed to terraform Earth to suit their biology, that biology could potentially be targeted. This thought gave me a fragile thread of hope to cling to as we prepared to continue our journey northward, away from the spreading alien presence. That first night at our temporary camp was tense and sleepless. We took shifts keeping watch, though none of us really slept much anyway. The sky continued to pulse with strange lights, and occasionally we'd feel that subsonic vibration ripple through the ground. It was quieter in the valley, with the stream masking some of our sounds, but we still spoke in whispers and kept movement to a minimum. Ray volunteered for the pre-dawn watch. He woke me about an hour before sunrise, his expression grim. "You need to see this," he said softly. I followed him to the edge of our camp. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could see strange green mist settling in patches throughout the valley, concentrated near the stream and spreading outward. It didn't behave like natural fog. It seemed almost deliberate in its movement, flowing against the breeze in some places. "What is it?" Ray asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but we should collect a sample." Using equipment from my field kit, I carefully collected a small amount of the greenish substance in a sealed container. The radiation detector showed normal levels, but something about the material made the hair on my arms stand up. It had an unnatural shimmer, and where it touched vegetation, the plant seemed to wilt slightly. By the time the sun rose, the mist had dissipated, but it left behind subtle changes in the affected areas, a slight discoloration of soil and vegetation. I suspected it was some kind of atmospheric alteration, perhaps related to the green vapor we'd seen trailing from the alien craft. We broke camp quickly, eager to move further from areas of alien activity. The children were exhausted and frightened, but they remained remarkably quiet. Emma, the younger of the Reeves children, tugged on my sleeve as we prepared to leave. "The air tastes different," she whispered. Children often notice things adults miss, their observations unclouded by preconceptions. I took her comment seriously. "Different how, Emma?" She thought for a moment. "Like when Mom cleans the bathroom. Chemical." I nodded, filing away this observation. The alien presence was already affecting our environment in ways we were only beginning to detect. We traveled for several hours, following the valley northward where the terrain provided both cover and a natural path. Around midday, we encountered our first sign of other survivors. A hastily abandoned campsite with supplies still present. A single backpack contained food, water, and a journal with entries dating to just the previous day. The final entry read, "They're hunting people. Not random. They take some, ignore others. Don't know the pattern yet." Frank examined the area with his military-trained eye. No signs of struggle. They left in a hurry, though. I checked the radiation levels in the area, higher than our previous location, but not dangerously so. Something had spooked these survivors enough to abandon valuable supplies. We took what was useful and continued moving, now with heightened caution. The terrain gradually became more rugged, with rock formations offering better concealment. By late afternoon, we found what seemed like a defensible position. A natural cave formation in a hillside, partially hidden by vegetation and with good visibility of the surrounding area. As the others set up our temporary shelter, I examined the sample of green mist I'd collected that morning. Using my portable microscope, I observed structures unlike anything I'd seen before. Formations that seemed to shift between solid and gaseous states, with complex molecular arrangements that defied conventional classification. Sarah noticed my concern. "What is it?" "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, "but it's not natural, at least not to Earth. It seems to be interacting with organic matter at a cellular level." "Is it dangerous?" she asked. "Potentially. We should minimize exposure until we understand it better." As evening approached, we established a watch rotation and rationed our supplies. The children were finally sleeping, exhausted from the day's journey. The adults gathered near the cave entrance to discuss our situation. "We need better information," Michael said. We're reacting blindly without understanding what we're dealing with. Agreed, I nodded. But gathering information means exposure, and that's risky. Frank leaned forward. Military doctrine for encountering unknown hostiles. Observe, identify capabilities, determine patterns, exploit weaknesses. We need to watch these things without being seen. We observed those craft scanning areas, Ray added. They're looking for something specific. I shared my developing theory. They appeared immediately after the nuclear exchange. That timing can't be coincidental. Either they were drawn by the energy signatures of the blasts, or they were waiting for us to weaken ourselves. Like vultures, Martha said quietly. Exactly, I agreed. Opportunistic predators that wait for vulnerability before striking. As darkness fell, the sky activity increased as it had each night since the nuclear strike. We extinguished all lights and maintained silent watch. Through gaps in the cave entrance, we could see the distant shapes of craft moving methodically across the landscape. Around midnight, we heard it, that distinctive sound of tearing metal combined with the subsonic vibration. It was much closer this time. We retreated deeper into the cave, hoping the rock would mask our presence. The sound grew louder. Through the cave entrance, a harsh, flickering light became visible, scanning the area outside. We pressed ourselves against the walls, hardly daring to breathe. The light paused at the cave entrance, illuminating particles of dust in the air. For one terrible moment, I was certain it had detected us. Then, mercifully, it moved on. The sound gradually faded as the craft continued its search pattern elsewhere. We remained frozen in place for several minutes afterward, afraid the slightest movement might attract attention. It was searching, Miguel whispered finally. But what for? An idea formed in my mind, a hypothesis based on my scientific training. The nuclear explosions released massive amounts of radiation. These entities arrived immediately afterward. What if they're detecting radiation signatures? You mean they can tell who's been exposed? Amy asked. Possibly. Radiation alters cellular structures in ways that might be detectable with advanced technology. Frank considered this. That would explain the pattern mentioned in that journal, taking some people, ignoring others. If that's true, Michael said, then those of us with higher exposure would be at greater risk. I nodded grimly. We should check everyone's exposure levels with the detection equipment. Knowledge is our best defense right now. Using my radiation detection equipment, I checked each person in our group. As I suspected, exposure levels varied significantly based on individual proximity to the blast and time spent in higher radiation zones. Frank, Ray, and I showed the highest exposure levels, having spent more time outdoors since the blast. The children, thankfully, showed minimal exposure. So, what does this mean for us? Sarah asked after I shared the results. It means we need to be strategic about movement, I explained. Those with higher radiation signatures should stay back during scouting missions, and we should continue moving away from blast zones where background radiation remains elevated. We established a watch schedule for the remainder of the night, with those showing lower radiation exposure taking the outside positions. I used the time to continue analyzing the green mist sample and documenting our observations. By dawn, I had developed several hypotheses about our situation, but we needed more data to confirm them. We decided to send out a small scouting party, Miguel and Amy, who showed the lowest radiation exposure, to observe alien activity from a concealed position, and, if possible, determine what happened to the people who abandoned the campsite we'd found. While they were gone, I worked with Michael and Sarah to establish better decontamination protocols and organize our limited medical supplies. Frank and Martha inventoried our food and water, calculating how long we could sustain ourselves without resupply. The children remained remarkably resilient. David, the older child, helped Ray maintain watch, while Emma sorted medical supplies with her mother. These simple tasks seemed to help them process the traumatic events they'd experienced. Around mid-afternoon, Miguel and Amy returned with troubling news. From a concealed position, they had observed one of the alien craft landing in a small clearing about 2 miles away. They described entities emerging from the craft, tall, insect-like beings with multiple limbs moving with precise, almost mechanical motions. They found a group of survivors, Amy said, her voice shaking. 3 people hiding in an abandoned building. The aliens seemed to scan them with some kind of device, then took 2 of them into their craft. "What about the third person?" I asked. "They just left him," Miguel replied. "He ran as soon as they were gone. We tried to make contact, but he was too frightened." This confirmed my radiation theory. "Did you notice anything about the people they took versus the one they left?" Amy nodded. The 2 they took had visible radiation burns. The one they left appeared uninjured. This information was crucial. The aliens were selectively taking people with higher radiation exposure and ignoring those with minimal exposure. But why? Were they collecting specimens, conducting some kind of study, or was it something more sinister? "There's something else," Miguel added. "We saw more of that green mist being released from their craft. It settled on the surrounding vegetation. Within minutes, the plants began to change. The color shifted slightly, and the structure seemed different. This aligned with my analysis of the mist sample." "They're altering our environment," I said. "Terraforming, but on a microscale initially." "Why would they do that?" Martha asked. "To make Earth more habitable for them," I explained. "Or less habitable for us." This realization added urgency to our situation. We weren't just dealing with hostile invaders. We were facing entities actively working to transform our planet into something alien. We spent the rest of the day fortifying our position and planning our next move. The cave provided good temporary shelter, but we couldn't stay indefinitely. Resources were limited, and the alien presence seemed to be expanding methodically outward from the blast zones. That evening, as darkness fell, we observed increased aerial activity. The massive craft over Detroit was now clearly visible even at our distance, its enormous form illuminated by strange lights. Smaller craft moved between it and the ground in a constant stream. Frank, who had been watching through binoculars, suddenly tensed. "They're moving this way," he said quietly, a search pattern spreading outward from the city. I checked radiation levels around our position, still elevated but not dramatically so. Would it be enough to attract attention? "We should move," Frank advised. "Tonight, under cover of darkness. Head further north, away from their expansion pattern." No one argued. We quickly gathered essential supplies and prepared to move out. Just before departing, I buried another cache of notes and samples, marking the location in case we needed to return or to help future survivors understand what was happening. We moved silently through the forest, staying under the canopy whenever possible. The night sky was alive with alien craft, their search patterns becoming more extensive with each passing hour. We used natural features for concealment, ravines, dense vegetation, rock formations, and paused frequently to ensure we weren't being tracked. The children were exhausted but understood the need for silence. David carried his sister when she became too tired to walk. Sarah and Michael moved with the focused determination of parents protecting their young. Ray and the college students maintained a perimeter around the group, while Frank led us through the terrain using his military navigation skills. Around midnight, we reached a small seasonal waterfall feeding into a series of rocky pools. The falling water masked our sounds, and the surrounding terrain offered multiple escape routes if needed. We decided to rest briefly before continuing our journey. As the others took a moment to recover, I climbed to a vantage point to scan the area we had just traversed. What I saw confirmed my fears. Alien craft were systematically searching the valley we had left, their distinctive lights illuminating sections of forest in a grid pattern. They were being thorough, expanding their search area with methodical precision. I rejoined the group, sharing what I had observed. They're searching everything now, not just targeting radiation hotspots. We need to keep moving. But where? Sarah asked, the exhaustion evident in her voice. How far do we need to go to be safe? It was a question I couldn't answer honestly. Nowhere might be truly safe if these entities continued to expand their presence. But we had to maintain hope. Northern Michigan has vast wilderness areas, I said. Low population density, minimal strategic targets. It's our best chance for now, and we might find other survivors, maybe even organized resistance. Frank nodded in agreement. Military contingency plans would establish outposts in remote areas. If any military units survived, they'll be regrouping away from blast zones. We continued our journey through the night, pushing ourselves to put as much distance as possible between us and the expanding alien search pattern. By dawn, we had covered nearly 15 miles of difficult terrain. We found shelter in a dense stand of pine trees, the thick canopy providing concealment from above. As the sun rose, we could see the transformed landscape behind us. Areas where the green mist had settled now showed visible changes. Vegetation with slightly altered colors and structures, soil with an unnatural sheen. The aliens weren't just hunting survivors. They were beginning to remake our world. The realization hit me then with full force. This wasn't just an invasion following a nuclear exchange, it was colonization. Earth had been weakened by our own weapons, and something had been waiting for that moment of vulnerability. Something that had perhaps been watching us for longer than we knew. I didn't share these darkest thoughts with the group. They needed hope to continue. But as a scientist, I had to face the data objectively. We were witnessing the beginning stages of an extinction event, not just for humans, but for Earth's entire biosphere as we knew it. Yet even in that moment of grim realization, my scientific mind continued analyzing, looking for patterns and weaknesses. These entities had specific search methodologies. They had biological forms that must have limitations. They were transforming our environment, which meant they couldn't immediately adapt to it as it was. Every organism, no matter how advanced, has vulnerabilities. If these aliens needed to terraform Earth to suit their biology, that biology could potentially be targeted. This thought gave me a fragile thread of hope to cling to as we prepared to continue our journey northward, away from the spreading alien presence. We spent that morning resting in shifts, hidden beneath the dense pine canopy. The area showed no signs of the green mist or alien activity, but we remained vigilant. Our supplies were dwindling faster than anticipated due to our accelerated pace. We needed to find sustainable food and water sources if we were going to survive long term. Around midday, we heard it. That terrible sound of tearing metal mixed with the subsonic vibration that resonated in your chest. It was much closer than before. We immediately took cover, pressing ourselves flat against the ground beneath the trees. Through gaps in the canopy, I could see one of their scout crafts, a sleek, metallic object about the size of a small car, but with an unconventional shape that seemed to shift slightly as it moved. It hovered about 50 feet above the tree line, slowly sweeping the area with what appeared to be scanning technology. The children were remarkably quiet, their parents holding them close. Frank signaled for absolute stillness. The craft moved methodically, its scanners creating patterns of light that penetrated the canopy in places. It paused directly above our position. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched a beam of greenish light slowly sweep across the forest floor, not 10 feet from where I lay. The beam passed over a small rodent, a squirrel or chipmunk, and the animal froze momentarily before collapsing. The light continued its path, eventually moving away from our position. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the craft resumed its search pattern and moved on. We remained motionless for another 20 minutes before Frank finally signaled it was safe to move. "It killed that animal," Miguel whispered, pointing to the small furry body lying motionless where the beam had touched it. I carefully approached the animal, using a stick to examine it without direct contact. "It's not dead," I said with surprise. "It's paralyzed, but still breathing." This was significant information. The scanning technology had some kind of stun capability, presumably to immobilize potential specimens. I made careful notes of this observation, knowledge that might prove valuable for future encounters. "We need to move," Frank insisted. "That craft will likely return on its search grid." We gathered our supplies quickly and continued northward, moving with increased caution. The terrain became more challenging, steeper hills and denser forest, but this also provided better concealment from aerial observation. By late afternoon, we reached the edge of a small clearing and stopped abruptly. Frank, who was leading, raised his hand in warning. We crouched low, peering carefully through the undergrowth. What we saw made my blood run cold. In the clearing stood one of the aliens, the first I had seen up close. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with a body structure reminiscent of terrestrial insects but with disturbing differences. Its exoskeleton had a metallic sheen, with sections that seemed almost translucent, revealing complex internal structures pulsing with an unnatural light. Multiple limbs moved with precise, calculated movements as it examined something on the ground. That something was human. A man lay motionless on the ground, apparently stunned like the small animal we had seen earlier. The alien was scanning him with a handheld device, methodically moving from head to toe. When the scan was complete, the alien made a series of clicking sounds that seemed to emanate not from any recognizable mouth, but from its entire body. In response to these sounds, a small craft descended into the clearing. The alien effortlessly lifted the man and carried him into the craft, which then ascended rapidly and disappeared from view. The alien remained in the clearing, now directing its attention to the surrounding vegetation. It removed a device from what appeared to be a storage pouch and began systematically applying a substance to various plants. Where this substance touched, the plants visibly changed, colors shifting, structures altering in subtle but distinct ways. We watched, motionless and silent, as the alien continued its work. I was struck by the methodical scientific approach it took, reminiscent of how I might conduct field research but with an alien purpose that filled me with dread. After about 15 minutes, the alien completed its task and activated another device. A moment later, it simply vanished, not with a dramatic effect, but as if it had stepped through an invisible doorway and closed it behind itself. We remained hidden for another half hour, ensuring it was truly gone before cautiously approaching the clearing. The vegetation the alien had treated was already showing pronounced changes: leaves with altered venation patterns, stems becoming more rigid and angular, colors shifting from natural greens to subtly different hues with a metallic quality. "They're changing the plants at a genetic level," I said, carefully collecting samples using tweezers from my field kit. "This isn't just terraforming the atmosphere or soil, they're re-engineering Earth's biology." "Why?" Sarah asked, keeping the children well away from the altered plants. "To make Earth more compatible with their biology," I theorized, "or to produce resources they need. Maybe both." We decided to avoid the clearing entirely, circling around it and continuing northward. This encounter had confirmed several of my hypotheses while raising new questions. The aliens were clearly collecting human specimens, specifically those with radiation exposure, and systematically altering Earth's ecosystem. As we traveled, I shared my developing theories with the group. These beings are methodical and scientific in their approach. They're not just randomly destroying, they're transforming and harvesting with specific goals. What goals? Michael asked. Based on their behavior, I'd say colonization, I replied. The nuclear exchange weakened our global defense capabilities and provided radiation signatures that seem to interest them specifically. They're collecting irradiated humans as specimens and transforming our ecosystem to suit their needs. You think they planned this? Ray asked incredulously. Waited for us to nuke ourselves? Maybe not planned it exactly, I clarified. But they might have been observing Earth for some time, waiting for an opportunity. The nuclear exchange created ideal conditions for their intervention. By evening, we had put several miles between ourselves and the clearing. We found shelter in a rocky overhang beside a small stream, a position that offered both concealment and access to water. As we established our temporary camp, I continued analyzing the plant samples I had collected. Under my portable microscope, the changes were even more pronounced at the cellular level. The plant cells showed completely reorganized internal structures. Chloroplasts altered to process different wavelengths of light, cell walls reinforced with unknown compounds, genetic material with nonsensical sequences by Earth standards. They're creating a hybrid ecosystem, I explained to Michael and Amy, who had scientific backgrounds. Not completely alien, but not Earth native either. A transitional biosphere that could eventually support their biology completely. How long would that take? Michael asked. Based on the rate of cellular transformation I'm observing, I calculated. And assuming they continue expanding outward from initial sites at the pace we've witnessed, significant regional changes could occur within weeks. Global transformation might take months or years, depending on their resources and methods. This timeline was both terrifying and potentially hopeful. If the transformation would take time to complete, humanity might have a window to resist or adapt. That night, as most of the group slept, Frank and I discussed potential strategies. His military background complemented my scientific knowledge. Every invader has supply lines, command structures, and vulnerabilities, Frank reasoned. Even these aliens must have limitations. They seem to require specific environmental conditions, I agreed. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to transform our ecosystem. That's a potential vulnerability. And they're interested in radiation signatures, Frank added. That could be exploited as bait or as a means of tracking their movements. We developed a rough plan. Continue moving northward while gathering intelligence about alien behavior, capabilities, and potentially weaknesses. If we could understand their biology and technology better, we might identify exploitable vulnerabilities. Our conversation was interrupted by a distant sound that had become all too familiar, the tearing metal noise of alien craft. This time, however, it was followed by something new. Explosive concussions and flashes of light on the horizon. Human weapons fire, Frank identified immediately. Heavy caliber, military grade. We climbed to a higher vantage point and watched the distant conflict. Through Frank's binoculars, we could see human military vehicles engaging alien craft. The human weapons seemed effective in some cases, bringing down smaller alien vehicles, but the larger craft responded with weapons that cut through tanks and armored vehicles with terrifying precision. "They're fighting back," Ray said with a mixture of hope and concern when we reported what we'd seen. "Yes, but conventional military tactics may not be effective against this kind of adversary," Frank cautioned. "These aliens have technology far beyond our own. Direct confrontation favors them." The battle continued for about 20 minutes before the human forces appeared to retreat or were eliminated. The alien craft resumed their methodical search patterns, now focused on the area where the conflict had occurred. This encounter provided valuable information. Human weapons could damage alien technology, at least the smaller craft. The aliens weren't invulnerable, but conventional military approaches alone wouldn't be sufficient against their superior technology. By dawn, we were on the move again, continuing northward while avoiding open areas. The day passed without direct alien encounters, though we observed increased aerial activity in the distance. The transformed vegetation was becoming more common, appearing in patches throughout the forest. Late in the afternoon, we came across something unexpected, a human structure that showed signs of recent habitation. It was a ranger station, small but solidly built, with solar panels on the roof and a radio antenna. The door was secured but not locked. Frank and I approached cautiously while the others remained hidden. A quick reconnaissance suggested the station was empty but had been occupied recently. Inside, we found basic supplies: food, water, medical kit, and something unexpected, a ham radio setup that appeared functional. Frank examined the radio equipment. "It's been modified," he observed. "The frequency range has been expanded, and there's some kind of shielding around the components." I noticed a logbook beside the radio. The final entry was dated just 2 days earlier. "Moving to Whiskey Point per captain's orders. Anyone finding this station, tune to frequency 7.255 MHz at midnight for resistance broadcast." This was our first evidence of organized human resistance, possibly military forces regrouping in the wilderness as Frank had predicted. We secured the station and brought the rest of our group inside. For the first time since the nuclear strike, we had solid walls around us and basic amenities. The children were especially relieved. Emma immediately curled up on a small cot and fell asleep, while David examined the station's equipment with curious eyes. Sarah inventoried the medical supplies, while Michael and Amy helped me set up a more comprehensive laboratory space using my equipment combined with what was available at the station. As night approached, Frank prepared the radio to receive the promised broadcast. We maintained vigilant watch, aware that the station might be more visible to alien craft than our previous forest hideouts. Shortly before midnight, Frank began carefully tuning the radio to the specified frequency. Static filled the room as he made minor adjustments, eventually finding a clear signal. For nearly a minute, there was only silence on the frequency. Then, a voice spoke, calm, measured, and unmistakably human. "This is Captain Eleanor Chen, United States Army Special Forces, broadcasting to all survivors. If you're receiving this message, you are not alone. Organized resistance continues in multiple locations. The entities are not invincible. They have weaknesses we are beginning to exploit." The voice paused briefly before continuing. "We have established a secure zone at the former Sawyer Air Force Base in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Civilians with military, scientific, or medical backgrounds are especially needed. Approach with caution using the following routes only." The broadcast provided detailed instructions for reaching the base safely, including areas to avoid due to alien activity and recognition signals to identify friendly forces. For those who cannot travel safely, maintain shelter in place. Document alien activities and capabilities. We are particularly interested in their biological characteristics and response to Earth's native environment. Future broadcasts will occur at this frequency every 3 nights at midnight. The transmission ended with a series of coded messages that Frank identified as military communications likely intended for specific units. This broadcast changed everything. We weren't alone in our resistance. Organized human forces were regrouping and analyzing the invaders, perhaps developing strategies to combat them effectively. "Sawyer is about 100 miles north of our current position," Frank calculated. "Difficult terrain, but navigable in a few days if we maintain good pace and avoid enemy contact." The group unanimously agreed to attempt the journey. The ranger station provided a safe place to rest and prepare, gathering strength for the challenging trek ahead. That night, I continued analyzing the samples I had collected, comparing the alien-modified plants to normal specimens. I noticed something interesting that I hadn't seen before. Where the alien modifications met unaltered plant tissue, there were signs of cellular rejection, similar to immune responses in animals. The Earth plants were attempting to resist the alien changes at a biological level. This observation sparked a new line of thinking. If Earth's vegetation showed natural resistance to alien modification, perhaps this was a vulnerability we could exploit. Earth's biosphere had evolved over billions of years, developing complex defense mechanisms against invasive organisms. The aliens might be technologically superior, but they were operating in a biosphere fundamentally foreign to their own biology. As I documented these observations, I heard something outside, a faint sound that didn't belong to the forest. I alerted Frank, who immediately signaled for silence and dimmed the station's lights. Through the window, we saw it, one of the alien hunters moving through the forest about 100 yards from the station. It moved with that unsettling precision I had observed earlier, methodically examining the environment as it went. We remained absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe. The hunter paused, seeming to sense something. It turned toward the station, its sensory apparatus, not quite eyes but something analogous, scanning the building. For a terrible moment I was certain it had detected us. Then, unexpectedly, it turned away, continuing its previous path through the forest. Only after it had disappeared from view did we dare to move again. This close encounter reinforced the precariousness of our situation. Even with the hope provided by the resistance broadcast, we were still in immediate danger, surrounded by beings intent on transforming our world and studying us like specimens. We spent the remainder of the night preparing for our journey to the resistance base. The ranger station provided maps of the region, which Frank used to plot the safest route north. We inventoried and repacked supplies, prioritizing essential items for the journey ahead. By dawn, we were ready to move out. Before leaving, I left detailed notes about my observations of the alien biology and terraforming activities, secured in a waterproof container hidden in the station for other survivors or resistance members to find. As we stepped outside, the morning air felt different, heavier, with that subtle chemical quality Emma had noticed days earlier. The alien presence was changing our world in ways both obvious and imperceptible. Time was running out for humanity to mount an effective response. But for the first time since the nuclear strike and alien arrival, I felt a genuine spark of hope. We weren't facing this alone, and as a scientist, I knew that understanding an adversary was the first step toward defeating it. Every observation, every sample, every encounter provided data points that might ultimately reveal the alien's crucial weakness. We moved out, heading north toward the resistance base, our pace purposeful and our determination renewed. The journey would be dangerous, but the alternative, allowing these entities to transform Earth unchallenged, was unthinkable. What we didn't know then was that we would encounter something on that journey that would fundamentally change our understanding of the invasion and provide the first real key to fighting back against our alien colonizers. We set out at dawn, moving quickly but cautiously through the forest. Frank led the way, using his military training to establish a secure route north. The terrain became increasingly rugged as we advanced, with steep hills and dense vegetation that slowed our progress but provided excellent cover from aerial observation. By mid-morning, we had covered about 5 miles when Ray, who was scouting slightly ahead, signaled for us to stop and take cover. We quickly concealed ourselves in a dense thicket, hardly daring to breathe as we listened. The sound was unmistakable, human voices, not just one or two, but several people moving through the forest about 100 yards east of our position. Frank and I exchanged glances. After our encounter with the military broadcast, we were hopeful these might be friendly forces, but caution was essential. Frank signaled for the group to remain hidden while he and I moved forward to assess the situation. We crept through the underbrush, using natural cover to approach without being detected. When we were close enough to observe the group, I felt both relief and concern. It was indeed a group of human survivors, about 20 people of various ages, including some children. They moved with purpose but lacked the discipline and coordination of military personnel. Many showed signs of radiation exposure and injury. Most concerning was their noise level, conversation and movement that seemed dangerously loud given the alien presence in the region. "Civilians," Frank whispered. Heading north, probably heard the same broadcast we did. I nodded in agreement. They're making too much noise, and some of them have significant radiation exposure based on the visible burns. We faced a difficult decision. Joining a larger group offered certain advantages: more resources, more skills, safety in numbers. But this particular group's lack of stealth and high radiation signatures made them potential targets for the alien hunters. After a brief discussion, we decided to make contact but maintain our independence. We approached cautiously, with Frank calling out a greeting from concealment before we revealed ourselves. The group reacted with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Their apparent leader was a woman in her 40s named Rebecca, who had been a local sheriff before the attacks. She explained they had been traveling for 3 days from a small town about 40 miles southeast. "We heard the military broadcast," she confirmed, "figured our best chance was to reach their base." I nodded. "That's our destination as well. But we've been observing the aliens, and they seem particularly interested in people with radiation exposure." Rebecca grimaced. "We've noticed. Lost 3 people yesterday when one of those things tracked us. Took the ones with the worst radiation burns, left the others." We shared information about our observations and the aliens' apparent patterns. Rebecca's group had valuable information as well. They had witnessed alien craft depositing the green mist over wider areas, and several in their group had backgrounds that provided useful insights. One man had been a botanist, another a meteorologist who had observations about how the alien presence was affecting weather patterns. After discussion, we agreed to travel in proximity but not as a single large group. Rebecca's people would maintain about half a mile distance from us, with coordinated rest periods and regular communication via handheld radios they had salvaged. As we prepared to continue our journey, I noticed something unsettling about some members of Rebecca's group. Several showed unusual symptoms beyond radiation exposure: faint greenish discoloration at the edges of wounds, slightly altered patterns in their iris coloration. I took Rebecca aside and asked about these symptoms. "Started about 2 days ago," she explained. "First thought it was some kind of infection from the environment. But it's spreading, and it doesn't respond to antibiotics." This was deeply concerning. The alien terraforming appeared to be affecting humans directly, not just the environment. I asked if I could examine one of the affected individuals. A man named Paul volunteered, showing me a cut on his arm that had the greenish discoloration around its edges. Using my portable microscope, I examined tissue samples from the wound edge. What I saw confirmed my fears: cellular structures being altered in patterns similar to what I had observed in the plants. The alien transformation wasn't limited to vegetation. It was beginning to affect animal life, including humans. I shared this concerning discovery with our group and with Rebecca. "The transformation is biological, not just environmental," I explained. "It's altering cellular structures at a fundamental level." "Is it contagious?" Sarah asked, instinctively pulling her children closer. Not in the traditional sense, I clarified. It's not a pathogen that spreads from person to person. It appears to be environmental exposure, direct contact with transformed materials or the green mist. This discovery added urgency to our journey. If the aliens' terraforming was beginning to affect humans, time was running out faster than we had anticipated. We continued northward, now more cautious about contact with altered vegetation and standing water that might contain residue from the green mist. By late afternoon, we had entered an area with more pronounced environmental changes. Entire stands of trees with altered coloration and structure, soil with an unnatural metallic sheen, even small animals with visible mutations. Frank pointed out what appeared to be a more direct route through a valley ahead. That would save us several hours of travel time, he noted. I checked the area with binoculars. The valley showed extensive signs of transformation, vegetation almost completely altered, with colors and structures that appeared increasingly alien. Too risky, I decided. The terraforming is advanced there. We should skirt around even if it takes longer. As we changed course to avoid the valley, we noticed something moving at its center. Not an alien hunter, but something equally disturbing. It appeared to be a deer, but grotesquely altered. Its body structure had changed, limbs elongated and joints reconfigured. Its skin had a metallic quality that caught the light in unnatural ways. Most disturbing was its movement. Not the fluid motion of a natural animal, but something mechanical and precise, as if its natural instincts had been overridden. They're not just changing the plants, Miguel whispered. They're altering the entire ecosystem. This transformed creature represented a new phase in the alien terraforming process, the creation of hybrid fauna adapted to the changing environment. I documented the observation carefully, noting the progression from plant alteration to animal transformation. As evening approached, we found shelter in a rocky outcropping that provided good visibility and multiple escape routes. We maintained radio contact with Rebecca's group, who had established their camp about half a mile west of our position. While the others prepared a cold meal and organized watch rotations, I continued analyzing my samples and observations. The pattern of transformation was becoming clearer. Systematic alteration of Earth's biosphere starting with microorganisms and vegetation, progressing to simple animals, and eventually affecting more complex life forms. The purpose seemed clear: making Earth's environment compatible with alien biology while preserving aspects of the existing ecosystem that might be useful to them. It wasn't simple destruction, but methodical colonization, replacing Earth's biosphere with one that served their needs. After sunset, Frank and I observed increased alien activity in the sky. Their craft moved with purpose, concentrating around specific areas and occasionally descending to the surface. Of particular concern was their apparent interest in Rebecca's group's location. Several craft passed directly over their camp, though they didn't immediately engage. Frank established radio contact with Rebecca. "You've got company overhead. Suggest immediate relocation." "Already moving," came the terse reply. They took 2 more of our people, the ones with the green symptoms. This was significant new information. The aliens were now specifically targeting humans showing signs of biological transformation. Were they monitoring the progress of their terraforming on human subjects, collecting specimens at various stages of change? The implications were disturbing. Around midnight, we heard distant sounds of conflict, human weapons fire, and the distinctive energy discharges of alien weapons. It came from the direction Rebecca's group had been heading. Frank immediately tried radio contact. No response. "We need to investigate," Ray insisted. "They could need help." "Or it could be a trap," Frank countered. "The aliens might be using them to draw out other survivors." After brief discussion, we decided on a compromise. Frank, Ray, and I would conduct a cautious reconnaissance while the others maintained our secure position. We moved silently through the forest, using natural cover and avoiding open areas. As we approached the source of the conflict, the sounds had ceased. From a concealed position on a wooded hillside, we observed a clearing below. The scene was grim. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, some human, some alien. Rebecca's group had apparently engaged the hunters directly, with devastating results on both sides. More surprising was the presence of human military personnel, soldiers in combat gear examining the site and collecting samples from the alien bodies. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the area and establishing a perimeter. Frank identified their insignia: Army Rangers, Special Forces. We remained hidden, observing their operation. The soldiers collected both human and alien bodies, loading them onto military vehicles with specialized containment equipment. They appeared particularly interested in humans showing signs of the biological transformation, carefully securing these specimens in separate containers. After the military team departed, we cautiously approached the site to search for survivors from Rebecca's group. We found none. Whatever conflict had occurred had been brief but devastating. The clearing provided something else valuable: our first opportunity to examine alien remains up close. The military had missed some fragments of alien biology, a section of limb, tissue samples, and most importantly, a damaged piece of technology that appeared to be part of their scanning equipment. I carefully collected these samples using my field equipment, avoiding direct contact. The alien tissue was unlike any terrestrial biology. Cellular structures that seemed to blend organic and inorganic components with what appeared to be metallic elements integrated into the biological matrix. The technology fragment was equally fascinating, not purely mechanical, but a hybrid of biological and technological components that functioned together as a single system. It was damaged, but still had residual energy readings. We returned to our group with these valuable samples and the concerning news about Rebecca's people. The military presence was both hopeful and worrying. Organized human resistance continued, but their interests seemed to include collecting transformed human specimens for unknown purposes. I spent the remainder of the night analyzing the alien samples. The biology was extraordinarily advanced. Cells that could alter their function and structure rapidly, integrated technological components that enhanced biological capabilities, and genetic material that appeared designed rather than evolved, with perfect symmetries and repeated patterns impossible in natural evolution. The technology fragment provided insights into their scanning capabilities. It appeared designed to detect specific radiation signatures and biological markers, explaining their targeted abduction of irradiated humans and, more recently, transformed individuals. By dawn, I had developed several hypotheses about the aliens' biology and technology. Most importantly, I identified potential vulnerabilities. Their biological systems showed sensitivity to certain earth compounds, particularly some plant alkaloids and fungal extracts. Their technology, while advanced, operated on principles that might be disrupted by specific electromagnetic frequencies. We resumed our journey at first light, now with more urgency given the fate of Rebecca's group. The terrain became increasingly challenging as we moved northward, with steeper hills and denser forest. The transformation of the environment was more pronounced in some areas, creating surreal landscapes of altered vegetation and hybrid creatures. Around mid-morning, we encountered our first direct challenge. The path ahead led through a narrow valley that showed minimal signs of transformation, a promising route. As we began to enter the valley, Frank suddenly signaled for us to freeze. Ahead, barely visible among the trees, was an alien hunter. It hadn't detected us yet, occupied with collecting samples from the environment. We couldn't retreat without potentially drawing attention, and we couldn't proceed without encountering it directly. Frank silently indicated that we should spread out and take cover. We did so with practiced caution, each finding concealment among the trees and undergrowth. The children, to their credit, remained absolutely silent, understanding the grave danger. I found myself positioned behind a fallen tree about 50 yards from the alien. From this vantage point, I could observe its activities while remaining hidden. It was methodically collecting plant and soil samples, analyzing them with handheld equipment, and occasionally applying the transformative substance to selected areas. What happened next was completely unexpected. A small earth animal, a raccoon, emerged from the underbrush near the alien. Instead of fleeing or being captured, the raccoon exhibited unusual behavior. It approached the alien purposefully, then released a spray of liquid directly at the hunter's sensory apparatus. The alien's reaction was immediate and dramatic. It convulsed violently, its limbs thrashing in what appeared to be extreme distress. It emitted a high-pitched sound unlike anything I had heard from them previously. After several seconds of this apparent agony, it activated its technology and vanished, the same disappearing technique we had observed earlier. The raccoon, seemingly unaffected, continued on its way into the forest. This incident was remarkable. An earth animal had effectively defended itself against an alien hunter using what appeared to be a naturally occurring compound. Once we were certain the alien was gone, we cautiously approached the area. On the ground where it had stood was residue from whatever the raccoon had sprayed. I carefully collected a sample, recognizing its potential importance. "Did you see that?" Ray whispered as we regrouped. "That raccoon took down an alien." I nodded, excitement building despite the danger. Earth's biosphere is fighting back. Native wildlife may have natural compounds that affect alien biology adversely. This observation aligned with my earlier hypothesis about the alien's potential vulnerability to Earth biochemistry. If a raccoon's defensive spray could incapacitate a hunter, other naturally occurring compounds might have similar or even more dramatic effects. We continued our journey with renewed hope, now actively looking for signs of biological resistance to the alien transformation. I observed areas where the terraforming appeared to have stalled or reversed, patches of native vegetation reclaiming transformed terrain, natural Earth microbes competing successfully with alien alternatives. By mid-afternoon, we reached the edge of a significant waterway, a river that would need to be crossed to continue northward. The water showed minimal signs of transformation, flowing clear and apparently normal. However, the opposite bank revealed extensive alien modification, vegetation completely transformed into hybrid forms, soil with the characteristic metallic sheen, and strange structures that appeared to be monitoring stations or terraforming equipment. We faced a difficult choice: cross the river and risk exposure in the heavily transformed area, or find an alternative route that might add days to our journey. Time was critical given the progressing transformation of the environment and the presence of military forces that might help us reach the resistance base. As we debated our options, I continued analyzing the raccoon spray sample. What I found was fascinating: a compound similar to the animal's natural defensive chemicals but with subtle alterations, as if the raccoon's biology had adapted specifically to counter the alien presence. This suggested something profound. Earth's biosphere wasn't just passively resisting the alien transformation, it was actively adapting to fight it. Evolution accelerated by existential threat, producing targeted defenses against the alien biology. If Earth's life forms were developing natural countermeasures, humanity might find allies in the most unexpected places, the plants and animals already fighting their own silent war against the invaders. This revelation would prove crucial in the days ahead, as we encountered both greater dangers and unexpected opportunities in our journey toward the resistance base. After careful consideration, we decided to cross the river but avoid the heavily transformed area visible on the opposite bank. Frank identified a potential crossing point about a mile downstream where the river narrowed and the opposite shore showed less alien modification. The decision made, we moved cautiously along the riverbank, staying under the cover of vegetation. The river itself was a boundary of sorts, a natural feature that had temporarily slowed the spread of alien transformation. The water appeared to dilute or neutralize the transformative agents, creating a barrier to their progress. This observation reinforced my developing theory that Earth's natural systems had inherent resistance to alien modification. As we approached the crossing point, I took water samples for analysis. Under my portable microscope, I observed native microorganisms actively breaking down alien biological components. Another example of Earth fighting back at the most fundamental level. We crossed the river in pairs, with Frank going first to secure the far bank. The water was cold and swift, but manageable, reaching just above waist height at its deepest point. The children crossed with adults, David carried by Michael and Emma by Ray. Our supplies were carefully wrapped in waterproof materials from our emergency kits. Once across, we immediately sought cover in an area of mixed transformation, patches of normal vegetation interspersed with altered plants. This boundary zone was fascinating from a scientific perspective, a living laboratory showing the interaction between Earth biology and alien modifications. From our concealed position, we observed an alien monitoring station about a quarter-mile away, a sleek structure with no clear entrance, emanating pulses of energy at regular intervals. Several hunters moved around it with purpose, collecting samples and maintaining equipment. "We need to avoid detection and continue north," Frank advised. "That station likely has extensive scanning capabilities." I agreed, but noted the scientific value of the site. That station could provide crucial information about their terraforming technology. If we could observe it more closely or obtain samples from it, we might identify vulnerabilities. After discussion, we decided on a compromise approach. The main group would continue northward along a route Frank identified as having good cover, while Ray, Miguel, and I would conduct a brief reconnaissance of the monitoring station before rejoining them. As the others moved out, we three approached the alien facility with extreme caution, using natural cover and moving only when the hunters were facing away. We reached a position about 100 yards from the station, concealed in a depression with good visibility. What we observed was both fascinating and disturbing. The station appeared to be a nexus for the terraforming process, emitting pulses that accelerated the transformation of surrounding vegetation. Hunters brought samples from various locations, placing them in analysis devices that projected data in unfamiliar formats. Most interesting was their apparent frustration with certain samples. One hunter presented a specimen, a small flowering plant, that seemed to resist their transformation attempts. The hunter and another entity engaged in complex communication, examining the specimen with various instruments and attempting different approaches to modify it. "That plant is fighting back," I whispered, focusing my binoculars on the interaction. "Its natural biology is resisting their transformation technology." Ray pointed to another area where hunters were examining what appeared to be animal remains. "Look there. They're studying local wildlife, too." I shifted my focus and saw they were dissecting what looked like forest animals. Raccoons, similar to the one that had repelled the hunter, squirrels, and several bird species. They seemed particularly interested in the animals' defensive and immune systems. This confirmed my theory. The aliens were encountering resistance from Earth's biosphere and actively studying it to overcome this resistance. This was a potential vulnerability we might exploit. As we prepared to withdraw and rejoin our group, something unexpected happened. A hunter emerged from the station carrying a container of the green transformative substance. It began applying this to the surrounding area in a pattern that would intersect with our planned escape route. We were effectively trapped, unable to move without entering an area being actively transformed and likely monitored. We would need to wait until the hunter completed its task and moved to another location. For nearly an hour, we remained absolutely still as the hunter methodically worked its way across the landscape. The transformed vegetation began showing changes almost immediately. Colors shifting, structures reorganizing, even movements that plants shouldn't be capable of. Finally, the hunter returned to the station, leaving the newly transformed area unattended. We had a narrow window to escape before the changes progressed further or other hunters emerged. "We need to move now," Frank whispered. "Stay low, move quickly, and avoid direct contact with the transformed plants." We slipped from our hiding place and moved along the edge of the transformed zone, keeping to patches of natural vegetation whenever possible. We were about halfway to the rendezvous point when Ray suddenly stumbled, his hand briefly contacting one of the transformed plants. He jerked back immediately, but not before a visible reaction occurred. The plant seemed to respond to his touch, extending filaments that briefly adhered to his skin before he pulled away. "Are you all right?" I asked as we continued moving. Ray examined his hand. "Burns a little, like a mild chemical irritation." I made a mental note to examine the area more thoroughly once we reached safety. We continued our escape, eventually reaching the rendezvous point where the others waited anxiously. "What happened?" Frank asked, noting our concerned expressions. I explained our observations at the monitoring station while examining Ray's hand. The skin where contact occurred showed slight discoloration, not the greenish hue of transformation, but a reddened irritation, like an allergic reaction. "The plant defended itself against me," Ray explained with wonder. "It recognized me as foreign and responded defensively." This was a fascinating observation. The transformed plants retained aspects of Earth biology's defensive mechanisms, but redirected them against native Earth life. The aliens weren't creating an entirely new ecosystem, but perverting existing one to treat Earth's native inhabitants as foreign threats. I treated Ray's hand with antihistamines from our medical supplies and took a small sample of tissue for analysis. Under the microscope, I could see cellular responses mobilizing against the alien compounds, his immune system fighting the foreign influence. Unlike the transformed humans we had observed, Ray's brief contact hadn't initiated a conversion process. "Your body is fighting it off," I told him with relief. "The transformed plants transfer compounds that initiate change, but limited exposure can be resisted by a healthy immune system." This was valuable information. Transformation wasn't instantaneous or inevitable with minimal exposure. The human body had natural defenses that could resist the alien influence, at least initially. We continued our journey northward, now with greater caution regarding contact with transformed environments. By evening, we had reached an area of dense forest that showed minimal alien influence, perhaps protected by its remote location or natural features that slowed the spread of transformation. We established camp in a defensible position with good escape routes, maintaining our routine of watch rotations and minimal fire. As night fell, the sky showed increased alien activity, more craft moving with purpose, concentrated around what we assumed were major population centers or strategic locations. While the others rested, I continued analyzing the samples we had collected, particularly the raccoon spray and tissue from Ray's exposure. The raccoon's defensive compound showed remarkable properties, molecular structures that bound to and neutralized the alien transformative agents. Ray's tissue samples showed similar immune responses but less specialized and efficient. An idea began forming in my mind. If we could isolate and concentrate the compounds that enabled Earth organisms to resist transformation, we might develop countermeasures or even weapons against the invaders. I shared this theory with Frank during our watch shift. "Earth's biosphere is already fighting back," I explained. "Some organisms are developing specific defenses against the alien biology. If we could harness these natural compounds, we might have a way to slow or reverse their terraforming." Frank considered this thoughtfully. A biological countermeasure rather than a technological one. Use their own methods against them. Exactly. They're using biology as a weapon to transform our world. We might use Earth's biology as a defense. This approach aligned with humanity's limitations in the current crisis. We couldn't match the aliens' technology, but we had intimate knowledge of Earth's biology and access to organisms already evolving defenses against the invasion. Our discussion was interrupted by an unexpected sound. A low, pulsing hum emanating from the north. It wasn't the tearing metal sound of alien craft, but something different, something human. Frank raised his binoculars, scanning the northern horizon. Aircraft, human design, military drones. Through the night vision equipment, we could see several small drones moving in formation, scanning the area methodically. Unlike the alien craft, these moved with recognizable human flight patterns and used conventional propulsion. This was the first concrete evidence we had seen of organized military resistance beyond the radio broadcast. The drones appeared to be conducting reconnaissance, documenting alien positions and transformation zones. We briefly discussed trying to signal the drones, but decided against it. Any communication attempt might draw unwanted alien attention. Instead, we documented their flight patterns and operational areas, information that might help us locate military forces as we continued northward. By morning, we had developed a more refined plan. We would continue toward the resistance base as our primary objective, but with a secondary mission of collecting biological samples from organisms showing resistance to alien transformation. These samples might prove valuable to scientists at the base working on countermeasures. As we prepared to move out, Ray showed me his hand where the transformed plant had made contact. The irritation had subsided, but a small patch of skin showed unusual properties. Increased sensitivity to light and temperature, cellular structures slightly altered, but not transformed. It's like my body reached a stalemate with whatever that plant transferred, he observed. Not converting, but not completely normal either. I examined the area carefully. Your immune system contained it, but some changes persisted at the cellular level. This might actually be useful. Your tissues could provide insights into how human biology resists transformation. Ray nodded grimly. Glad my accident might help, though I'd prefer not to be a laboratory specimen. Not a specimen, I assured him. A collaborator. Your first-hand experience with exposure and resistance could be invaluable to developing protections for others. We continued our journey through increasingly varied terrain, areas of heavy transformation interspersed with patches of normal ecology. The pattern wasn't random. The aliens appeared to be establishing transformation corridors connecting strategic locations, creating networks of altered environment rather than transforming everything simultaneously. Around midday, we encountered something unexpected, a transformed zone that was reverting to normal. Plants that had shown alien characteristics were being overtaken by aggressive native vegetation, their structures breaking down and being recycled by Earth microorganisms. I collected samples from this area, fascinated by the natural counterattack occurring at the ecological level. Under my portable microscope, I could see Earth fungi and bacteria systematically breaking down alien cellular structures, essentially digesting the foreign biology and returning it to the native carbon cycle. Earth is fighting back on its own, I explained to the group. Native decomposers are adapting to consume the transformed materials, its evolutionary adaptation accelerated by existential threat. This observation gave us renewed hope. The alien terraforming wasn't proceeding unchallenged. Earth's biosphere had 4 billion years of evolutionary history, developing responses to invasive organisms. The aliens might have advanced technology, but they were still biological entities operating in a foreign ecological system that was actively resisting them. By late afternoon, we reached a significant landmark, a highway running east-west that showed signs of recent human activity. Tire tracks, footprints, and organized defensive positions suggested military or organized survivor presence. Frank examined the area with his military expertise. Recent patrol, probably within the last 12 hours. Well-equipped, maintaining vehicular capability despite EMP effects. This aligned with what we had expected from organized resistance forces. The military would have hardened vehicles resistant to electromagnetic pulse effects, allowing mobility even after the nuclear strikes. We decided to follow the highway westward, moving parallel to it but staying under forest cover for concealment. If this was indeed a military patrol route, it might lead us to a forward operating base or contact point for civilians seeking the resistance. As dusk approached, we observed increased activity, both human and alien. Military drones continued reconnaissance overhead, while alien craft maintained search patterns that seemed specifically focused on finding human survivors. We established a temporary camp in a defensible position with good visibility of the highway. Frank organized watch rotations while I continued analyzing our most recent samples. The reverting vegetation showed remarkable properties, not just a return to normal, but enhanced resistance to future transformation attempts, as if the exposure had triggered evolutionary adaptations. Around midnight, we observed vehicle headlights approaching from the east. 3 military vehicles moving with discipline, maintaining blackout protocols with minimal lighting. They stopped about half a mile from our position, establishing a temporary checkpoint and deploying personnel in defensive positions. This was our opportunity to make contact with organized resistance forces. After careful discussion, we decided Frank and I would approach alone while the others remained concealed. If anything went wrong, Ray would lead the group continued northward toward the resistance base. We approached carefully using proper military protocols that Frank knew would identify us as civilians rather than threats. When we were about 100 yards from their position, Frank called out the recognition phrase we had heard in the radio broadcast. "Lighthouse stands despite the storm." There was a tense pause before a response came back. "And guides the lost to safety." This was the correct countersign. We were officially in contact with the human resistance. The military personnel approached cautiously, weapons ready but not directly aimed at us. Their leader, a woman with captain's insignia who introduced herself as Captain Diane Rodriguez, assessed us quickly. "Civilians heading north?" she asked, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "Yes," I confirmed. "We heard the broadcast about the resistance base at Sawyer. I'm Dr. Tobias Lockwood, CDC disease ecologist. My companion is Frank Wilson, retired military." Her expression changed at the mention of my background. Disease ecologist. That's a stroke of luck. We're specifically looking for people with biological science backgrounds. I explained that we had a group including a nurse, a science teacher, and college students with relevant training. More importantly, I had been collecting samples and observations of the alien biology and terraforming activities. Captain Rodriguez made a quick decision. "We can transport your group to Forward Operating Base Evergreen. It's about 20 miles northwest of here, a staging area before Sawyer. We have scientists working on understanding the invasion, and your observations could be valuable." Frank asked about the security situation between our position and the FOB. "Manageable," Rodriguez responded. "We've established secure corridors and have countermeasures for alien detection. Their hunting patterns are becoming predictable." I signaled to Ray, who brought the rest of our group forward. Captain Rodriguez assessed them quickly, paying particular attention to radiation exposure levels and any signs of transformation. Satisfied they posed no immediate risks, she organized transportation in the military vehicles. The vehicles themselves were impressive, modified for post-EMP environment with hardened electronics and alternative power systems. As we drove northwest through the darkness, Rodriguez explained the current situation. The invasion followed the nuclear exchange by exactly 73 minutes, she informed us. Too precise to be coincidental. Current theory is they were waiting for us to weaken ourselves, perhaps even influencing the escalation of tensions that led to the exchange. This aligned with my own theories about opportunistic invasion. Rodriguez continued, describing the military response. Conventional weapons have limited effectiveness against their technology, but they're not invincible. Their smaller craft can be brought down with concentrated fire, and the hunters can be killed, though it usually takes multiple hits to critical areas. She confirmed my observations about their interest in radiation-exposed humans. They're collecting specimens, particularly those with higher radiation exposure. Initially, we thought they were simply studying radiation effects, but now we believe there's something more specific they're looking for. I shared my observations about the terraforming process and the beginning transformation of human tissues. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Our scientists have observed the same patterns. They're not just studying us, they're trying to transform us, or at least some portion of the population. This was disturbing confirmation of my worst fears. The aliens weren't just transforming Earth's environment. They were attempting to convert humans into something compatible with their altered ecosystem. As we approached Forward Operating Base Evergreen, security measures intensified. Multiple checkpoints, camouflage systems, and what appeared to be electronic countermeasures designed to mask human presence from alien detection. The base itself was well concealed, built into a hillside with most facilities underground or under camouflage netting. It had clearly been a prepared facility, likely part of continuity of government plans for post-nuclear scenarios. Upon arrival, we were processed through medical screening and decontamination. The procedures were thorough and scientifically sound, indicating they had experienced personnel managing potential radiation and biological risks. After processing, we were separated for specialized debriefing based on our backgrounds. The children and most adults were taken to civilian quarters while I was escorted to a scientific section of the facility. Frank went with military personnel for tactical debriefing. The scientific area was impressive despite limited resources. Converted military equipment repurposed for biological and physical analysis, staffed by a mix of military and civilian scientists working with focused urgency. I was introduced to the lead scientist, Dr. Eleanor Chen, a virologist who had been working on biological weapons defenses before the invasion. She greeted me with the weary relief of someone desperate for relevant expertise. Dr. Lockwood, your background is exactly what we need. We have physicists analyzing their technology and military strategists studying their tactics, but too few biologists understanding their actual physiology and terraforming methods. I shared my samples and detailed observations with Dr. Chen and her team. They were particularly interested in the raccoon spray that had repelled the hunter and the samples from the reverting vegetation zones. This confirms our developing theory, Dr. Chen explained as she examined the samples. Earth's biosphere isn't passively accepting transformation. It's actively resisting and adapting. She showed me their research, more extensive than mine given their resources, but reaching similar conclusions. The aliens were biological entities with integrated technological components, attempting to transform Earth's environment to suit their physiology while preserving elements useful to their needs. Most importantly, they had identified specific vulnerabilities in the alien biology. They're sensitive to certain compounds common in Earth's biosphere, Dr. Chen explained, particularly alkaloids, terpenes, and specific microbiological metabolites. Substances that our native species evolved as defense mechanisms. This aligned perfectly with my observations about the raccoon's defensive spray and the reverting vegetation zones. Earth organisms were developing targeted countermeasures against the alien biology. Dr. Chen took me to a separate laboratory where they were attempting to weaponize these discoveries. We're developing delivery systems for concentrated forms of these compounds, she explained. Early field tests show promising results against both the hunters and their terraforming technology. The approach was elegant in its simplicity, using Earth's evolved defenses as weapons against the invaders. Rather than trying to match their advanced technology, we were leveraging our planet's biological complexity against them. I was assigned quarters and integrated into the scientific team. The following morning, Dr. Chen introduced me to the base commander, Colonel James Harris, who explained the broader military situation. We're maintaining defensive positions around key resources and survivor concentrations, he explained. Conventional military approaches have proven ineffective against their major vessels, but we've had success against the hunters and smaller craft. He described a strategy of asymmetric warfare, avoiding direct confrontation in favor of targeted strikes against vulnerable components of their operation, particularly terraforming installations and hunter deployment areas. Your biological insights could help us develop more effective countermeasures, he noted, particularly if we can disrupt their terraforming process or neutralize the hunters more efficiently. I spent the next day working intensively with Dr. Chen's team, developing protocols for extracting and concentrating the compounds that showed effectiveness against alien biology. We created a prioritized list of native organisms likely to produce useful defensive compounds, focusing on those already showing resistance to transformation. By evening, we had developed a prototype biological countermeasure, a concentrated solution derived from the raccoon's defensive compounds combined with extracts from resistant plant species. Early laboratory tests showed it degraded alien cellular structures and disrupted their transformative agents. While the scientific work progressed, I reconnected with our group. The Reeves family had been assigned quarters appropriate for a family unit. Sarah's medical skills had already been put to use in the base's medical facility, while Michael was helping with the education program established for children and teenagers at the base. Frank had been integrated into the security operations team, his experience proving valuable in analyzing alien hunting patterns and developing countermeasures. Ray had volunteered for a research program studying limited exposure to transformative agents, his hand providing valuable data on human resistance mechanisms. The college students, Amy, Miguel, and Jason, were assigned roles matching their skills. Amy and Miguel joined the biological research team, while Jason worked with the communications group maintaining contact with other resistance outposts. That night, Colonel Harris called a briefing for key personnel. Intelligence had identified a major alien terraforming installation being established approximately 30 miles south of our position, a facility that would significantly accelerate environmental transformation in our region if allowed to become operational. We're planning a strike operation, Harris explained. Our objective is to destroy the facility before it becomes fully functional. Based on Dr. Chen and Dr. Lockwood's research, we've developed specialized weapons incorporating the biological countermeasures they've identified. The plan was sophisticated, a combined operation using conventional explosive charges enhanced with delivery systems for our biological agents. The attacking force would be small and mobile, avoiding detection until the last possible moment. Dr. Chen explained the biological components. The delivery system will disperse concentrated compounds that disrupt their cellular structures and interfere with their integrated technology. If successful, this should not only destroy the facility but potentially create a zone resistant to future terraforming attempts. To my surprise, Colonel Harris turned to me. Dr. Lockwood, we're requesting your participation in this operation. Your first-hand experience observing alien biology and terraforming methods could prove crucial for identifying critical targets within the facility. I hesitated. My training was scientific, not military, but I understood the importance of the mission and the unique perspective I could provide. I'll participate, I agreed, but in a scientific capacity only. I'm not trained for combat operations. Harris nodded. Understood. You'll be with the technical team, protected by security personnel. Your role is observation and target identification only. The operation was scheduled for the following night. I spent the intervening time finalizing the biological countermeasures with Dr. Chen's team and receiving a crash course in military field protocols from Frank. Stay with your assigned security detail, he advised. Follow their instructions immediately without question. If things go wrong, their priority will be getting you out safely. The intelligence you carry is considered high value. The night of the operation arrived with tense preparation. The strike team consisted of 30 personnel divided into 4 functional groups: perimeter security, assault team, technical specialists, and scientific advisors. I was assigned to the latter group alongside Dr. Chen and 2 military scientists. We moved out under cover of darkness, using vehicles with modified signatures to avoid alien detection systems. The journey took approximately 2 hours, following carefully plotted routes that minimized exposure to known alien patrol areas. As we approached within 5 miles of the target, we switched to foot movement, using terrain features for concealment. Through night vision equipment, I could see the alien facility in the distance, a structure unlike anything I had previously observed, with geometric patterns that seemed to defy conventional architectural principles. The surrounding area showed advanced transformation: vegetation completely altered, soil with the characteristic metallic sheen, even the air visibly different with a slight greenish tinge. This was terraforming in its more advanced stages, approaching completion rather than the initial phases I had observed elsewhere. Our approach was methodical and careful, with reconnaissance drones scouting ahead to identify hunter positions and patrol patterns. When we reached the designated observation point approximately half a mile from the facility, the technical team established monitoring equipment to analyze the structure. What we observed was both fascinating and disturbing. The facility appeared to be a nexus for terraforming operations, with pipelines extending outward carrying the transformative agents to surrounding areas. Hunters moved with purpose around the structure, maintaining equipment and collecting data for monitoring stations. Most concerning was a central section where we observed what appeared to be human subjects, individuals in various stages of transformation, contained in transparent chambers. The aliens were systematically exposing them to different variants of the transformative agent, documenting the results in what could only be described as methodical experimentation. "They're using humans as test subjects," Dr. Chen whispered, horror evident in her voice, "refining their transformation process through experimentation." This discovery added moral urgency to our mission. We weren't just preventing environmental transformation, we were potentially rescuing human beings from nightmarish experimentation. The assault team leader, Major Davis, requested my assessment of critical targets within the facility. "Based on what you've observed of their biology and terraforming methods, where should we focus our attack to maximize disruption?" I studied the facility structure carefully, identifying patterns that aligned with what I knew of their biological technology. The central processing area appears to be their equivalent of a biochemical laboratory, I indicated, and those pipeline junctions are distribution nodes for the transformative agent. Targeting those points would disrupt both production and distribution. Major Davis nodded, updating the attack plan accordingly. "We move in 30 minutes. All teams prepare for synchronized assault." The waiting was excruciating, watching the aliens conduct their heartless experiments while we prepared to strike. I focused on finalizing the targeting data for our biological agents, ensuring they would be deployed for maximum effectiveness. As the assault teams moved into position, "The delivery system will disperse concentrated compounds that disrupt their cellular structures and interfere with their integrated technology. If successful, This should not only destroy the facility but potentially create a zone resistant to future terraforming attempts. To my surprise, Colonel Harris turned to me. "Dr. Lockwood, we're requesting your participation in this operation. Your first-hand experience observing alien biology and terraforming methods could prove crucial for identifying critical targets within the facility." I hesitated. My training was scientific, not military, but I understood the importance of the mission and the unique perspective I could provide. "I'll participate," I agreed, "but in a scientific capacity only. I'm not trained for combat operations." Harris nodded. "Understood. You'll be with the technical team, protected by security personnel. Your role is observation and target identification only." The operation was scheduled for the following night. I spent the intervening time finalizing the biological countermeasures with Dr. Chen's team and receiving a crash course in military field protocols from Frank. "Stay with your assigned security detail," he advised. "Follow their instructions immediately without question. If things go wrong, their priority will be getting you out safely. The intelligence you carry is considered high value." The night of the operation arrived with tense preparation. The strike team consisted of 30 personnel divided into 4 functional groups: perimeter security, assault team, technical specialists, and scientific advisors. I was assigned to the latter group alongside Dr. Chen and 2 military scientists. We moved out under cover of darkness, using vehicles with modified signatures to avoid alien detection systems. The journey took approximately 2 hours, following carefully plotted routes that minimized exposure to known alien patrol areas. As we approached within 5 miles of the target, we switched to foot movement, using terrain features for concealment. Through night vision equipment, I could see the alien facility in the distance, a structure unlike anything I had previously observed, with geometric patterns that seemed to defy conventional architectural principles. The surrounding area showed advanced transformation: vegetation completely altered, soil with the characteristic metallic sheen, even the air visibly different with a slight greenish tinge. This was terraforming in its more advanced stages, approaching completion rather than the initial phases I had observed elsewhere. Our approach was methodical and careful, with reconnaissance drones scouting ahead to identify hunter positions and patrol patterns. When we reached the designated observation point approximately half a mile from the facility, the technical team established monitoring equipment to analyze the structure. What we observed was both fascinating and disturbing. The facility appeared to be a nexus for terraforming operations, with pipelines extending outward carrying the transformative agents to surrounding areas. Hunters moved with purpose around the structure, maintaining equipment and collecting data for monitoring stations. Most concerning was a central section where we observed what appeared to be human subjects, individuals in various stages of transformation, contained in transparent chambers. The aliens were systematically exposing them to different variants of the transformative agent, documenting the results in what could only be described as methodical experimentation. "They're using humans as test subjects," Dr. Chen whispered, horror evident in her voice, "refining their transformation process through experimentation." This discovery added moral urgency to our mission. We weren't just preventing environmental transformation, we were potentially rescuing human beings from nightmarish experimentation. The assault team leader, Major Davis, requested my assessment of critical targets within the facility. "Based on what you've observed of their biology and terraforming methods, where should we focus our attack to maximize disruption?" I studied the facility structure carefully, identifying patterns that aligned with what I knew of their biological technology. "The central processing area appears to be their equivalent of a biochemical laboratory," I indicated, "and those pipeline junctions are distribution nodes for the transformative agent. Targeting those points would disrupt both production and distribution." Major Davis nodded, updating the attack plan accordingly. We move in 30 minutes. All teams prepare for synchronized assault. The waiting was excruciating, watching the aliens conduct their heartless experiments while we prepared to strike. I focused on finalizing the targeting data for our biological agents, ensuring they would be deployed for maximum effectiveness. As the assault teams moved into position, it was physically distinct from the hunters, taller, with more complex integrated technology and different body structure. Most notably, it demonstrated clear command functions, coordinating the hunters with sophisticated tactical awareness. Dr. Chen suggested this indicated a hierarchical social structure. If their society has specialized castes or roles, identifying the command structure could provide strategic advantages. Neutralizing command entities might disorient or reduce the effectiveness of hunter groups. The data collected during our mission was analyzed throughout the night. By morning, the intelligence team had reached several significant conclusions. The facility we destroyed had been more important than initially estimated, a regional coordination center for terraforming operations across much of Michigan. Its destruction would substantially set back alien transformation efforts in our region. More concerning was evidence of accelerated experimentation on human subjects. The aliens were systematically testing various transformation agents, apparently seeking optimal methods for converting humans into something compatible with their altered ecosystem. Colonel Harris called a strategy meeting to discuss our next steps. Our successful strike has demonstrated the effectiveness of biological countermeasures, but we've likely drawn significant attention. Intelligence indicates increased alien activity throughout the region, including deployment of technologies we haven't previously encountered. Satellite imagery, from the few military satellites still functioning, showed alien craft converging on the destroyed facility site. Among them was a vessel much larger than the scouts and transports we had previously observed, a command ship deploying what appeared to be specialized recovery and analysis equipment. They're assessing our attack methods, Dr. Chen noted, learning what we used against them. This raised an urgent concern. If the aliens adapted to our biological countermeasures, we would lose our most effective weapon against them. We needed to accelerate development of more complex biological agents that would be harder for them to counter. I was assigned to lead a specialized research team focused on identifying and developing new biological countermeasures. Our priorities were twofold: creating enhanced versions of our existing agents and identifying entirely new compounds that could affect alien biology. For the next 2 days, we worked intensively in the base's laboratory facilities. I integrated my field observations with the Resistance's accumulated research, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities in alien biology. Ray's exposure site provided valuable insights into how human tissue interacted with transformative agents, while our samples from resistant organisms suggested new defensive compounds. What emerged was a fascinating scientific picture. The aliens weren't simply replacing Earth's ecosystem with their own, they were creating a hybrid biosphere that preserved aspects of Earth biology they found useful while transforming others to support their physiological needs. This hybrid approach created inherent vulnerabilities. By attempting to maintain certain Earth biological functions while altering others, they created unstable ecological interactions. Native organisms were exploiting these instabilities, developing accelerated adaptations that specifically targeted alien biological weaknesses. On the 3rd day after our strike mission, our research took a significant leap forward. One of the scientists on our team, Dr. Patel, identified a fungal species that had evolved to specifically colonize transformed plant tissue, systematically breaking down alien cellular structures and converting them back to forms compatible with Earth's carbon cycle. It's essentially eating the transformed tissue, Dr. Patel explained excitedly, and reproducing rapidly in the process. Natural selection at its most efficient, an organism finding a new ecological niche and exploiting it aggressively. This discovery suggested a new approach to fighting the alien terraforming, not just neutralizing their transformative agents, but actively promoting biological processes that would revert transformed areas to their natural state. We immediately began cultivating the fungus in quantity, developing delivery systems that would spread its spores efficiently across transformed zones. While this research progressed, the military situation evolved rapidly, alien activity increased throughout our region, with hunting parties becoming more numerous and aggressive. Several smaller resistance outposts reported contact with new types of hunters, variants with enhanced sensing capabilities and more resilient biology. Most concerning was a pattern of systematic scanning focused on areas where our biological agents had been deployed. The aliens were clearly attempting to analyze and counter our methods. On the fourth day, the situation escalated dramatically. Our perimeter sensors detected a large alien force approaching from the south. Multiple hunters accompanied by several of the command entities we had identified, all converging on our approximate location. Colonel Harris ordered immediate preparation for potential evacuation. They're hunting us specifically now, not just conducting general sweeps. Our strike hit them hard enough to warrant a targeted response. The base shifted to high alert with non-essential personnel preparing for evacuation, while defense teams established perimeter positions. Dr. Chen and I worked frantically to secure our research and prepare our most promising countermeasures for deployment if needed. By evening, the alien force had closed to within 10 miles of our base. Their movement patterns suggested systematic search operations rather than direct knowledge of our location, but their technology would eventually detect us despite our countermeasures. Colonel Harris made the difficult decision to implement a strategic withdrawal. We'll relocate to Sawyer Base in phases, starting with civilian personnel and critical research assets. Defense teams will maintain position to cover the evacuation. I was designated for the first evacuation group due to the critical nature of my research. Before departing, I met briefly with Frank, who would remain with the defense forces. "Get the research to Sawyer," he told me firmly. "What you've developed might be our best hope for pushing them back." I reluctantly agreed, helping to secure our biological samples and research data for transport. The Reeves family would also be in the first evacuation group, along with other civilians and scientific personnel deemed critical to continued research. The evacuation began at midnight, using vehicles with modified signatures to minimize detection. Our convoy consisted of 5 vehicles moving north along carefully plotted routes, designed to avoid known alien patrols. The journey was tense, with frequent stops to assess the surroundings and adjust our route based on scout reports. About halfway to Sawyer, our lead vehicle detected unusual energy signatures ahead, consistent with alien technology but in a pattern we hadn't previously encountered. Our convoy commander, Lieutenant Wilson, ordered a halt while scouts investigated. They returned with disturbing news. "There's a new type of alien tech ahead, some kind of energy field stretched across our route. It doesn't match any patterns we've seen before." This presented a serious obstacle. Deviating significantly from our planned route would take us through areas with higher alien activity, increasing our risk of detection. Attempting to pass through the unknown energy field could trigger detection systems or cause harm to personnel and equipment. I suggested a third option. If it's an energy field designed to detect human presence, we might be able to mask our signatures using biological countermeasures. I explained that some of our research had shown that certain biological compounds interfered with alien scanning technology, disrupting the frequencies they use to detect human biological signatures. We had several canisters of these compounds in our research materials. After brief discussion, Lieutenant Wilson approved my plan. We prepared the biological masking agent, distributing it throughout our vehicles and personnel. The compound would temporarily alter our detectable biological signatures, potentially allowing us to pass through the energy field undetected. Our convoy proceeded cautiously. As we approached the energy field, our instruments detected its active scanning, searching specifically for human biological markers. We held our breath as the lead vehicle entered the field, then passed through without triggering any apparent response. One by one, our vehicles passed through successfully. The biological masking agent had worked, its compounds interfering with the specific frequencies used by the alien detection system. Once clear of the field, we increased our pace, knowing the masking agent would degrade within hours. By dawn, we had reached the outer perimeter of Sawyer Air Force Base, now the primary headquarters for human resistance in our region. Sawyer was impressive, a hardened military facility that had been designed to withstand nuclear attack, now repurposed as a command center for resistance operations. Multiple layers of security surrounded the base, combining conventional military measures with adaptations specifically designed to counter alien detection methods. We were processed through security and decontamination, our research materials carefully handled to preserve their integrity. I was immediately taken to meet with the base's scientific director, Dr. Marcus Wright, a former DARPA researcher specializing in biological defense systems. Dr. Wright wasted no time integrating our research into ongoing projects. "Your fungal discovery is particularly promising," he noted after reviewing our data. "We've observed similar adaptive organisms, but nothing with such specific targeting of transformed tissues." He showed me their facilities, significantly more advanced than what we had at Forward Operating Base Evergreen. Multiple laboratories dedicated to different aspects of understanding and countering the alien biology, staffed by scientists from various disciplines working cooperatively. Most impressive was their containment facility, where they maintained live specimens of alien biology, tissue samples from hunters, segments of their technology, and various stages of transformed vegetation. These were being systematically studied to identify vulnerabilities and develop countermeasures. Dr. Wright explained their current focus. "We're developing what we call reversion bombs, delivery systems for concentrated biological agents that not only halt transformation, but actively revert areas to Earth normal biology. Early field tests show successful reversion of areas up to half a mile in radius from a single deployment." This aligned perfectly with our fungal discovery. If we could combine our rapidly reproducing fungus with their delivery systems, we might create countermeasures capable of reverting larger transformed areas more quickly. I was assigned quarters and integrated into their primary research team. The Reeves family was settled in the civilian section of the base, where Sarah's medical skills and Michael's teaching background were immediately put to use. The children were enrolled in the base's education program, providing them with much-needed structure and normalcy despite the circumstances. That night, we received concerning news from Forward Operating Base Evergreen. The alien force had located the base and initiated a systematic assault. Our defense teams were holding temporarily but would need to implement a fighting withdrawal soon. The remaining personnel and critical equipment would attempt evacuation along alternative routes to Sawyer. Among those still at Evergreen was Frank, who had volunteered to command one of the perimeter defense teams. The thought of him facing the alien assault filled me with dread, but I forced myself to focus on my research, developing countermeasures that might ultimately save more lives. The following day brought a breakthrough. By combining our fungal organism with compounds developed at Sawyer, we created a biological agent with enhanced effectiveness against transformed environments. Laboratory tests showed it could revert transformed tissues to Earth-normal biology at an accelerated rate while reproducing itself to spread beyond the initial deployment area. Dr. Wright immediately recognized the potential. This could change our strategic approach completely. Instead of just defending areas from transformation, we could actively reclaim territories already transformed. We began large-scale cultivation of the enhanced fungal agent, preparing delivery systems that could disperse it efficiently across transformed zones. If successful, this could shift the balance of our conflict with the aliens, creating expanding zones of Earth normal biology resistant to their terraforming efforts. As this work progressed, we received updates about the situation at Evergreen. Our forces had successfully implemented their fighting withdrawal, with most personnel evacuating safely. However, several defense teams remained engaged, conducting delaying actions to cover the evacuation. Frank's team was among those still fighting. Reports indicated they were holding a critical choke point, preventing alien forces from pursuing the main evacuation route. Their position was precarious but essential for the others' escape. I found myself distracted by worry, though I tried to maintain focus on my research. Dr. Wright noticed my concern and shared some encouraging information. "We're sending a rapid response team to extract the remaining defenders at Evergreen," he explained. "They're equipped with our latest countermeasures, including some based on your initial research. If anyone can get those people out safely, they can." This provided some comfort, though the situation remained deeply concerning. I channeled my worry into more intensive work, pushing to finalize our enhanced biological agent for field deployment. By evening, we had prepared the first batch of what we were now calling restoration spores, the enhanced fungal agent combined with compounds that accelerated its growth and increased its effectiveness against alien biology. Initial testing showed promising results, with transformed tissues reverting to Earth normal biology within hours of exposure. As we completed this work, news arrived from the extraction team sent to Evergreen. They had successfully reached the base and were in the process of extracting the remaining defenders. Frank's team had held their position against significant alien pressure, allowing other groups to withdraw safely. Later that night, the extraction team returned to Sawyer with the Evergreen survivors. Among them was Frank, exhausted but alive. His account of the defense action was sobering. The aliens had deployed new hunter variants with enhanced capabilities, along with technology specifically designed to counter our previous biological agents. "They're adapting quickly," Frank reported during debriefing, "learning from each encounter and modifying their approach accordingly. But they still have weaknesses. Their command structure remains centralized. Neutralize a command entity, and the hunters become less coordinated, more predictable." This information reinforced our developing strategy. If we could combine our biological countermeasures with targeted strikes against command entities, we might disrupt the aliens' terraforming operations more effectively than through either approach alone. The next morning, Colonel Harris, who had arrived with the last evacuation group from Evergreen, called a strategy meeting with senior military and scientific personnel. The information shared painted a complex picture of our situation. Satellite imagery and ground reports indicated the aliens were establishing a major command center approximately 50 miles east of Sawyer, a facility much larger than any previously observed in our region. This appeared to be their response to our successful strike and the demonstrated effectiveness of our biological countermeasures. "They're consolidating resources for a more coordinated approach to this region," Colonel Harris assessed, "likely preparing for a systematic push to complete transformation of the entire area." This presented both threat and opportunity. The concentration of alien resources made them a more dangerous adversary, but also created a potential high-value target. If we could strike this command center effectively, we might set back their entire regional operation. Dr. Wright presented our latest research explaining the potential of the restoration spores to not just halt, but reverse transformation. If deployed effectively, these could create expanding zones of restored Earth biology, essentially pushing back their terraforming front. Colonel Harris integrated this information into a bold, strategic proposal. "We're developing a plan to strike their new command center, combining conventional military action with deployment of these new biological countermeasures. If successful, we could reclaim significant territory and disrupt their regional command structure." The proposal was ambitious, but built on sound strategic principles. By targeting their command center with our most effective biological countermeasures, we could potentially create a cascading effect, disrupting their coordination while simultaneously triggering large-scale reversion of transformed environments. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Harris asked me to join a specialized planning team for the operation. My understanding of alien biology and terraforming methods would be crucial for identifying critical targets within their command structure. For the first time since the invasion began, I felt we were developing a truly effective response, not just reacting to alien actions, but implementing a proactive strategy to reclaim our world. The combination of military precision and biological countermeasures represented humanity's unique advantage, our ability to understand and leverage Earth's natural defenses against organisms attempting to transform it. What none of us realized then was that our preparations had not gone unnoticed. The aliens were developing their own response to our emerging strategy, one that would force us to accelerate our plans and take greater risks than we had anticipated. The crucial battle for Earth's biosphere was about to enter a new and more dangerous phase. The planning for our strike against the alien command center accelerated over the next 2 days. Our intelligence teams gathered detailed information about the facility, its structure, defensive capabilities, and the patterns of activity surrounding it. Drone reconnaissance provided visual data, while forward scouts reported on ground conditions and alien patrol patterns. What emerged was both concerning and informative. The command center was significantly more sophisticated than previous alien installations we had encountered. Multiple layers of security surrounded it, including energy fields similar to the one our convoy had penetrated and new variants of hunters with enhanced sensory capabilities. Most interesting was the facility's apparent purpose. Unlike the purely terraforming operations we had previously observed, this command center appeared to be coordinating a comprehensive strategic response to human resistance. It was gathering and analyzing information about our tactics, developing countermeasures to our biological weapons, and coordinating increasingly sophisticated hunting operations targeting our outposts and patrols. They're not just terraforming anymore, Colonel Harris noted during our strategic assessment. They're fighting a war now, adapting specifically to counter our resistance methods. This represented both a threat and an opportunity. The aliens were becoming more dangerous as they adapted to our tactics, but their focus on countering us specifically meant they were diverting resources from their broader terraforming efforts. We had forced them to engage on our terms rather than simply transforming Earth uncontested. As part of the planning team, I helped identify critical targets within the command center. My understanding of alien biology and their integrated technology allowed me to pinpoint vulnerabilities that conventional military analysis might miss. Their command entities appear to use a form of biological networking, I explained, highlighting areas within the facility where these interactions seem to occur. They share information through both technological and biological means. If we can disrupt this network at key nodes, we might disorient their entire command structure. Dr. Wright's team had developed an enhanced version of our restoration spores specifically designed to target these biological networks. This variant attacks the interface between their biological and technological components, he explained. It should disrupt their ability to coordinate while simultaneously triggering reversion of transformed tissues. Our plan took shape, a coordinated strike combining conventional military action with precise deployment of biological countermeasures. The operation would involve multiple teams with specific objectives, all synchronized to maximize impact and minimize our vulnerability to counterattack. I was surprised when Colonel Harris approached me directly. "Dr. Lockwood, we need you on this operation. Your understanding of alien biology and ability to identify critical systems in real time could be decisive." Despite my reservations about participating in another combat operation, I understood the importance of direct scientific observation. "I'll go," I agreed, but as before, in a scientific advisory capacity only. 2 days before the planned operation, our preparations were interrupted by an unexpected development. Our perimeter sensors detected a massive surge in alien activity throughout the region, not just around their command center, but across all their installations and terraforming zones. Satellite imagery confirmed something unprecedented. The aliens were accelerating their terraforming operations dramatically. The green mist was being deployed in quantities far beyond previous levels, transforming large areas simultaneously rather than the methodical progression we had observed before. "They're making a push to complete transformation of the region," Dr. Wright assessed grimly. "They must have detected our preparations and are attempting to establish irreversible ecological dominance before we can strike." This forced an immediate reevaluation of our timeline. What had been planned as a carefully prepared operation now became an urgent necessity. If the aliens completed this accelerated transformation, large portions of our region would become permanently hostile to human life, and our biological countermeasures might be less effective against the more established alien ecosystem. Colonel Harris made the difficult decision to accelerate our operation. "We move tomorrow at dawn. All teams prepare for immediate deployment." This compressed timeline increased our risks substantially, but the alternative, allowing the aliens to complete their accelerated terraforming, was unacceptable. Throughout the base, preparation intensified as teams finalized equipment, weapons, and the biological countermeasures that would be central to our strategy. I spent that night working with Dr. Wright's team to optimize our restoration spores for the specific conditions we expected to encounter. The accelerated alien terraforming had created environmental conditions more hostile to Earth biology than we had anticipated, requiring adjustments to our formulations. By dawn, we were as prepared as possible given the compressed timeline. The strike force consisted of 200 personnel divided into specialized teams: perimeter security, assault elements, technical specialists, and scientific advisors. I was assigned to the Central Scientific Team, responsible for identifying critical targets and deploying our biological countermeasures. Before departure, I visited the Reeves family to say goodbye. Sarah embraced me tightly. "Come back safe," she said simply. Michael shook my hand firmly. "The kids have been helping with the cultivation of your fungal countermeasures," he told me with pride. "Emma has a natural touch with the lab work." The children themselves seem to have adapted remarkably well to life in the resistance base. David showed me a diagram he had drawn of alien biology based on my descriptions, while Emma presented me with a small vial. "I grew these special ones," she said seriously. "They're extra strong." I accepted the vial, touched by her gesture and impressed by her scientific intuition. Examining the culture under a nearby microscope, I noted that she had indeed selected for a particularly robust strain of our restoration spores, one with enhanced reproductive capabilities. "These are excellent," I told her honestly. "I'll make sure they're included in our deployment." Frank joined me as I prepared for departure. He would be leading one of the perimeter security teams, his experience from the Evergreen Defense proving invaluable for our operation. "Remember what I taught you," he said as we checked our equipment. "Stay with your security detail, follow instructions immediately, and if things go wrong, focus on getting your biological weapons deployed before extraction." We moved out under cover of early morning darkness, using a combination of ground vehicles and low-flying aircraft designed to minimize detection. Our approach utilized terrain features for concealment, following routes specifically selected to avoid known alien patrol patterns. As we neared the command center, the transformed environment became increasingly apparent. Vegetation completely altered into alien forms. Soil, with the metallic sheen characteristic of advanced terraforming, and the air itself tinted with a greenish hue that indicated high concentrations of their atmospheric modifications. Most disturbing were the hybrid creatures we occasionally glimpsed moving through this transformed landscape. Earth animals altered beyond recognition, their natural forms twisted into configurations that served the aliens' ecological purposes. These weren't simply mutated animals. They were functional components of the alien ecosystem, their behaviors entirely controlled by the new biological imperatives encoded in their transformed tissues. Our convoy halted approximately 3 miles from the command center, establishing a forward operating base in an area of mixed transformation, not completely alien, providing some concealment from their detection systems. From this position, our drones conducted final reconnaissance of the target, confirming alien positions and activity patterns. The intelligence was concerning. The command center had enhanced its defensive measures since our last observation, with more hunters patrolling the perimeter and new technological systems that appeared designed to detect human presence at greater distances. Most significantly, we observed multiple command entities coordinating activities, not just 1 or 2 as we had seen previously, but at least 5 distinct command aliens directing different aspects of the operation. This indicated the facility's importance to their broader strategy. Colonel Harris adjusted our plan accordingly, allocating additional resources to neutralize these command entities early in our assault. They represent both the greatest threat and the most valuable targets, he explained. Eliminating them will significantly disrupt their coordination capabilities. As final preparations were completed, I prepared the biological countermeasures for deployment. We had developed multiple delivery systems, aerosol dispersal units for broad environmental exposure, targeted injectors for precision application to critical systems, and what we called reversion bombs, designed to create expanding zones of restored Earth biology. Included in these preparations was Emma's vial of specially cultured restoration spores. I incorporated her strain into our primary dispersal units, recognizing the enhanced reproductive capabilities she had intuitively selected for. The operation commenced at precisely the planned moment, with synchronized actions across multiple teams. Perimeter security neutralized hunter patrols using silenced weapons enhanced with biological agents. Technical teams disabled the outer defensive systems using electromagnetic countermeasures developed from studying alien technology fragments. Our main assault force breached the facility at predetermined points, creating controlled chaos that divided alien response capabilities. My scientific team followed the central assault element, protected by security personnel as we identified critical systems for targeting. Inside the command center, we found an environment more alien than anything I had previously encountered. The architecture itself seemed alive, with walls that pulsed with integrated biological and technological functions. Information flowed through conduits that blended organic and mechanical components, creating a living network that coordinated their operations throughout the region. Most disturbing were the human subjects we observed in various states of transformation. Hundreds of individuals, many completely altered beyond recognition, others in intermediate stages showing the progressive modification of their biology. These weren't just experimental subjects. They appeared to be integrated components of the command center's functioning, their transformed biology serving specific purposes within the alien system. I forced myself to focus on our objectives, identifying critical nodes in their biological network where our countermeasures would be most effective. There, I indicated to our technical team, pointing to a central chamber where multiple biological conduits converged. That appears to be their primary coordination nexus. Deploying countermeasures there should disrupt their entire command structure. Our team moved methodically toward this target, placing dispersal units at strategic points along the way. Each deployment created immediate visible effects, alien biological components reacting with distress as our restoration spores attacked their cellular structures, triggering reversion to Earth-compatible forms. The aliens responded with increasing coordination, hunters converging to protect critical systems while command entities directed countermeasures against our biological agents. They deployed a substance that appeared designed to neutralize our spores, an adaptation based on studying our previous attacks. However, Emma's strain proved unexpectedly resistant to their countermeasures. The enhanced reproductive capability she had selected allowed the spores to overwhelm the neutralizing agents, continuing their reversion effect despite alien attempts to stop them. As we approached the central coordination nexus, we encountered the most significant resistance. Multiple command entities converged on this location, recognizing our strategy and moving to protect their most critical systems. Our assault teams engaged these entities directly, using weapons specifically designed to target their integrated biological and technological vulnerabilities. The fighting was intense, with casualties on our side but also unprecedented success in neutralizing command aliens. My team seized the opportunity created by this engagement, pushing forward to deploy our primary dispersal unit directly into the coordination nexus. The device, containing concentrated restoration spores including Emma's enhanced strain, was designed to create a cascading effect throughout their biological network. As we activated the dispersal unit, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The alien biological components began rapid reversion, their carefully engineered structures breaking down into forms that Earth's native decomposers could process. The integrated technology, deprived of its biological interfaces, failed in cascade sequences throughout the facility. The command entities reacted with what could only be described as panic, their coordinated response dissolving into disoriented individual actions. Hunters lost the guidance that made them effective, their behaviors becoming erratic and predictable. "It's working," I reported to Colonel Harris via our communication system. "Their command structure is collapsing, and the reversion effect is spreading through their biological network." Harris immediately issued the next phase order. "Deploy the reversion bombs around the facility perimeter. Create an expanding zone of restoration." Teams moved to implement this directive, placing the specialized devices at calculated intervals around the command center. These bombs contained our most aggressive restoration spores, designed to create rapidly expanding zones of reverted biology that would push back the alien transformation front. As the devices activated, we could observe the effect spreading outward from the facility, a wave of biological reversion that transformed alien ecology back to Earth normal forms. The process wasn't instantaneous, but it accelerated as it progressed, the reverted areas themselves becoming sources of Earth native organisms that continued the restoration process. With our primary objectives achieved and the command center effectively neutralized, Colonel Harris ordered controlled withdrawal. "All teams extract in sequence, scientific personnel first priority." My team collected final samples and observational data before beginning our withdrawal. As we moved through the facility toward extraction points, I observed something remarkable. The human subjects in various stages of transformation were responding to our restoration spores, their altered tissues beginning reversion to human normal biology. This was an unexpected and profoundly important discovery. If transformation could be reversed in human subjects, we might be able to save those who had been captured and altered by the aliens. I documented this observation carefully, collecting tissue samples that might help develop specialized treatments for transformed humans. Our extraction proceeded with minimal resistance, the alien defensive capability severely compromised by the collapse of their command structure. As we moved away from the facility, we could observe the expanding zone of biological restoration, a growing area of Earth normal ecology pushing back against the alien transformation. The operation was an unqualified success. We had neutralized their regional command center, disrupted their coordination capabilities throughout the area, and demonstrated that their terraforming could be not just halted, but actively reversed through targeted biological countermeasures. As we returned to Sawyer Base, Preliminary reports indicated similar effects throughout the region. The destruction of the command center had triggered cascading failures in alien installations across Michigan, creating opportunities for resistance forces to reclaim transformed territories using our biological restoration methods. In the days that followed, I worked with Dr. Wright's team to analyze the samples collected during the operation, particularly those from partially transformed humans showing signs of reversion. We developed treatment protocols specifically designed to restore human biology, beginning trials with volunteers who had experienced limited exposure to transformative agents. The results were promising. Human tissue responded positively to our restoration treatments, reverting to normal biology without permanent damage in most cases. This opened the possibility of rescuing thousands of captured humans who had been subjected to alien transformation processes. Beyond the immediate tactical victory, our operation represented a strategic turning point in the conflict. We had demonstrated that Earth wasn't just passively resisting invasion. With human intervention directing and enhancing natural defense mechanisms, our biosphere could actively reclaim what had been taken. The aliens would adapt, of course, developing new approaches to counter our biological weapons, but so would we, continuing to identify and leverage Earth's natural resistance mechanisms against the invaders. The fundamental advantage remained ours, fighting on our home territory, with 4 billion years of evolutionary history developing defense mechanisms against foreign organisms. In the weeks that followed, resistance forces expanded operations throughout North America, applying the lessons and methods developed in our region. The pattern was consistent. Targeted strikes against command structures combined with deployment of biological restoration agents, creating expanding zones of reclaimed territory. I continued my research at Sawyer Base, now with expanded resources and personnel. The Reeves family remained integral to these efforts, with Sarah developing medical protocols for treating exposure victims, Michael establishing educational programs to train new scientific personnel, and the children contributing their unique perspectives to our ongoing work. Frank joined the strategic planning staff, his experience proving invaluable in developing tactics against evolving alien capabilities. Ray's partial exposure site provided ongoing research opportunities, helping us understand how human biology interacted with and resisted alien transformation attempts. As I record this testimony now, 6 months after the nuclear strikes and alien arrival, I can report genuine progress in our fight to reclaim Earth. The aliens continue to hold significant territory, particularly around major blast zones where their transformation is most complete. But they no longer expand unchallenged, and in many regions, their territory actively shrinks as our restoration efforts progress. This isn't just a story of survival against impossible odds, though it certainly began that way. It's an affirmation of life's remarkable resilience, Earth's biosphere fighting to preserve itself against foreign transformation, and humanity finding its role as defender and accelerator of that natural resistance. For those watching this who still struggle under alien control, know that resistance continues and grows stronger daily. The biological countermeasures we've developed are being distributed to resistance cells worldwide. The aliens are not invincible. They have vulnerabilities that become more apparent with each encounter. Most importantly, remember that you aren't fighting alone. Earth itself fights alongside you, its ancient biological systems adapting to resist these invaders, just as they have resisted countless threats throughout evolutionary history. Our planet has faced extinction-level events before and recovered. The alien invasion, following so closely after our self-inflicted nuclear wounds, is simply the latest challenge that life on Earth will overcome. I leave you with this final thought. In our darkest moment, when human civilization had crippled itself through nuclear conflict and alien invaders descended to claim our wounded world, we found unexpected strength not in matching their advanced technology, but in understanding and enhancing our planet's natural defenses. Our salvation came not from weapons of mass destruction, but from the humble fungi, bacteria, and adaptive organisms that form Earth's immune system. When facing existential threats, look not just to our human ingenuity, but to the resilient web of life that surrounds us. Earth has been fighting to survive for billions of years. Learn from it. Work with it. And know that even in the most transformed landscapes, life finds a way to reclaim what belongs to it. This is Dr. Tobias Lockwood, signing off for now. But our work continues, as does our resistance. Earth endures, and so shall we.